of all talk shows is back. Unleashed, unabridged, uncensored, and unbelievable. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Clowns and jokers everywhere. In the leader of the opposition office in London, in Westminster, there's been yet another coup. Jeremy Corbyn is now LC'd. John McDonnell, or Ramsay McDonnell as I call him, is now running the show. We'll be looking at the movie Joker and wondering what all the fuss is about. We'll be looking at the Joker, or is he a clown, in 10 Downing Street as the net closes in, not on the sex, but on the money. Speaking about sex and money, we'll be getting an update from the peerless Whitney Webb on the Epstein affair in the United States. And we'll be looking at the clowns that 20 years ago destroyed the multinational, multi-ethnic socialist experiment of Yugoslavia. What good came of it, ineluctably leading, as it did, to war after war after war. It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the Open University of the Airwaves. It's radio with pictures. Fasten your seatbelts. It's rock and roll radio.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
This is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of what I think they call the internet, invented by Al Gore, I seem to remember. On the internet, on SputnikNews.com, you can, and indeed are, listening to us all over the world. We're on FM in the Washington, D.C. area, 105.5, other magic numbers there. On AM across America, from coast to coast. But this is a radio show you can watch as well as listen. The number of platforms on which you can now watch us is so large, I'll not actually be able to adumbrate the list right now. But it's on Facebook, it's on YouTube, and it's even on Twitter. But whether you are watching or listening, you have to be vitally interested in the subjects that we're covering this evening, because the whole world depends on them. Well, not all of them, because we're looking at Joker, the new blockbuster Hollywood movie, and asking Adam Garrie, who's just been to see it, he's still eating the popcorn, in fact, in through the glass right now, and hot foot to deliver his verdict, but we'll have other verdicts too. In fact, we want your verdict. If you've seen it, make sure that you call me. The call number, I'm going to stress this evening, because I'm keen to boost the number of calls. The UK number is 0207 798 2255. That's 0207 798 2255. The US number 001 757 744 4480. But it's not only on the cinema screens that jokers, clowns are to be found. In 10 Downing Street, the net is closing in on Boris Johnson. Either he gets a deal with the European Union and Britain leaves the EU finally at Halloween, talking about clowns and jokers, on the 31st of this month, or he's in very serious trouble indeed. Serious trouble with the electorate, serious trouble with his own members of parliament, serious trouble with his allies across the Irish Sea, in the Democratic Unionist Party, all kinds of trouble. And they used to say that Labour MPs got into trouble over money and Conservative MPs got into trouble over sex, usually of an unusual variety. But Boris Johnson's now in trouble over money and sex, over his relationship with an American pole dancer, or sometimes called a businesswoman, who was holed up in Shoreditch. She was giving technology lessons of an afternoon to the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. Technology lessons, that's a new one. Floppy disks, hard disks, RAM rates, and all of that. It was all perfectly innocent, apparently. But what is more difficult to explain is that this pole dancer, with no track record of successful business, indeed now a trail of commercial devastation behind her, received £126,000 of taxpayers' money for a technology startup which never actually went anywhere. That's serious. The sex he can live with, the money he might not be able to live with. And if Brexit fails, expect that story to loom very large indeed. And then there's the jokers that destroyed Yugoslavia 20 years ago this week. It's a matter of great importance to me personally. I loved Yugoslavia. What was not to love? It was a multi-ethnic, multinational state brought into being by the partisans of Yugoslavia, who alone liberated themselves from Nazi occupation forces, who tied down throughout the Second World War divisions of Nazi occupation forces with their heroic patriotic resistance. Led by the then Marshal Tito, later the president of this multinational, multi-ethnic state, it took a different path from others in the socialist camp, and it was pretty successful too. They even had a wonderful football team. There you go. Now, Yugoslavia was destroyed by Tony Blair and by Bill Clinton. I said at the time, along with my friends Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Benn, that no good could come of this war, not just because we hated to see civilians, even the Chinese embassy, even the state television broadcaster being bombed, shelled, destroyed, people being killed, not just because we hated to look at that, but because we argued if they get away with this, ineluctably it will lead to war after war after war after war. And that is precisely what happened. And those fools who went along with the propaganda, some of it actual hoax, that drew them in to the conflict in Yugoslavia, would go on to repeat the trick in country after country after country. And they say there's a law of diminishing returns. Well, actually, each intervention grew more disastrous than the last. But the right to protect, RTP, doctrine developed by Blair in Chicago, developed in tandem with Bill Clinton, is the root of almost every conflict now raging in the world, every significant, globally overreaching conflict that's going on in the world today. It was a disastrous turn of events. I'm old enough to remember when the principle of non-interference in other people's internal affairs was an axiom of international law and indeed enshrined in the United Nations Charter and all of its works. That was all ripped up 20 years ago. And it now feels to me like it's been one long bloody war for 20 years from Yugoslavia onwards. We'll be talking to the great Neil Clark on Skype about that conflict soon enough in the show. We'll be talking about the clowns in Buckingham Palace who are not managing very well the seeping and extremely unattractive picture of Prince Andrew's relationship with the paedophile and malefactor Jeffrey Epstein. We'll be talking to the peerless Whitney Webb, who's broken so much of this story and was such a hit here on the mother of all talk shows on the previous occasions that she visited us. And, of course, we'll be talking about the situation in Syria. Now, let me lay my cards on the table. It is astounding to me that liberals, progressives, even people who call themselves socialists in the United States are mighty unhappy about the fact that President Trump has withdrawn his forces from Syria. I thought it was an axiom of progressive people everywhere to end US wars. Well, now it turns out it's the right that wants to end US wars, or at least some of them, and the left that are demanding that the US continue with the wars that they are in. Which is not to say I support the Turkish President Erdogan's invasion of Syria, not at all. America has no business in Syria, and neither does Erdogan have any business in Syria. Syria is a sovereign country whose borders are legally delineated, which is represented at the United Nations. Its territorial integrity must be upheld, or every actor breaking it is a criminal. So the Americans were criminals when they were there, and the Turkish armed forces are criminals now. Now, of course, Erdogan's army is laying waste to civilian people, to civilian infrastructure, killing people on the roads in the parts of Syria that they have invaded. The Kurdish people deserve the sympathy of every right-thinking person. 30 million Kurds in the world and no right of self-determination hardly anywhere at all. But the Syrian Kurds are Syrian. The area in which they live is part of Syria. It cannot be left outside of the control of the Syrian state, whose capital is Damascus. And the best thing now, even now, it's long, long past when it should have been done, is for the Syrian Kurds to invite the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab army to enter northeast Syria, where they can defend the whole territory of Syria against the Turkish incursions. The Sunday Times is reporting today something I've been talking about for months. There's a coup again in the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is being held hostage by his erstwhile ally, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor. The coup has reached its apogee in the busting up of Jeremy Corbyn's inner circle, the exile of his Chief of Staff, Garrie Murphy, out of Parliament altogether into the largely still hostile Labour headquarters several hundred yards away. A new OBE put in her place to control Jeremy Corbyn's office. The Sunday Times is reporting it today as a coup, and a coup it is. Its purpose is to change the Labour Party conference decision to hold a general election now, right after the deadline for leaving the EU, because Tom Watson and Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry and John McDonnell have changed their minds. Well, actually, their minds were always set on this, but they claim to have changed their minds. Now they don't want a general election. They want another 6 months before a general election so that they can hold a second rigged referendum to overturn the British people's decision in 2016 to leave the European Union. It's a coup not just against Corbyn. It's a coup against Britain. It's a coup against democracy itself. All of that and much more coming up. Now, on Donald Trump, the joker in the White House, I had my say on RT, on him, just a day or two ago. Take a look at this. Donald Trump is in deep doo-doo, facing again the threat of impeachment from the Democratic Party-controlled House of Representatives. Just when he thought it was safe to get back in the water, having shaken himself free of the hysteria of Russiagate, which was, of course, the Democratic Party's excuse for having lost to the most absurd presidential candidate in American history, he, having gotten clear of Robert Mueller and the deep state pursuit of him over Russiagate, is now embroiled in Ukrainegate. It turns out that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, just days after having been cashiered from the American military for offenses including the sniffing of crack cocaine in the twitch of a nostril, was placed on the board of a powerful and important Ukrainian oil and gas company. You may wonder what that company first saw in Hunter Biden. Well, the fact that his father was the Vice President of the United States was, of course, entirely coincidental. In an administration which was deeply involved, up to its neck involved, in the coup in Ukraine in the first place. Now, Ukraine's a very beautiful place, Kiev, a very beautiful city. Was he there for the dancing girls? Was he there for the chicken Kiev? Or was he there because his son was on the board of an important oil and gas company, being paid, incidentally, $50,000 US every month? Or was he there because the Obama-Clinton administration was so deeply involved in corruption, political and otherwise, that his presence was of vital familial importance? Well, that's up to you to make a judgment. I just tell you this, that Ukraine gave more money to the Clinton Foundation than any other country on the earth. That's including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and all the other big state funders. So what happened? Donald Trump made a phone call to the new president of Ukraine, asking him to make sure that investigations took place as to any possible corruption between the previous US administration and elements in Ukraine. Now, maybe I'm missing something, but to me, the scandal in that story is that an occupant of the White House may have been involved in financial political corruption with a foreign government. But such is the level of hysteria in US politics. It's Donald Trump's phone call that is now the bane of everyone's grief. My final point is this. All the liberals, all the centrists, even half of the leftists are praying in aid of this latest witch hunt, secret whistleblowing testimony from the CIA. The very CIA which for decades was public enemy number one of those same liberal, progressive, centrist and leftist elements in the United States. Now we're expected to believe that the CIA are knights in shining armor when they tried to bring down the presidency of Donald Trump. For the avoidance of doubt, I was not happy that Donald Trump was elected president of the USA. I was just really happy that Hillary Clinton wasn't.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Now get your tickets now for next Saturday night at the Liner Hotel in Liverpool. If you're anywhere near Liverpool, almost 200 seats have gone, but there's room for more. The Liner Hotel, Liverpool. I'll give you the details for tickets later. Me, Adam Garrie, Brian Travers, the founder member, sax player, songwriter of UB40, and a fantastic new band called the Jade Assembly, all next Saturday in the Liner Hotel in Liverpool. Now, we need your calls on 0207 798 2255 or in the US 001 757 744 4480. You can also tweet the show. There's a fair chance that we'll get your tweet on the air. You can tweet me at George Galloway or both George Galloway and GG Moats, where you may even be watching this show live right now. After this break, I'll be talking to Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire on all things Americana. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, as I said earlier, almost 200,000 people have watched last week's show. We expect that to grow this week. We also believe that at least as many people are listening as are watching. But we're still quite a way short of the 1 million global audience that I'm looking for. So spread the word, won't you? And if you're watching us on Facebook, please share with all of your friends. Now, Patrick Henningsen is one of my most favourite American journalists, broadcasters and analysts. He's almost always right about the events that we are discussing. His outfit is called 21st Century Wire. I hope you're already following it and supporting it in every way, as Patrick is amongst those that it's most important to hear from on all things Americana. And I'm glad to say he joins me now. Patrick, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Let's start with Donald Trump and Syria, because although the Ukraine gate looked to be opening its jaws ready to bite him, we'll come back to that, it's his decision to do what he said he would do in the course of the election campaign and get America out of endless foreign wars in the Middle East that has got the establishment, the liberals, the media, all on his tail now. What's it all about?
Well, you have to look back at previous administrations to find out where to start looking on this problem. And there's an extraordinary continuity of foreign policy that goes from administration to administration. And Donald Trump, with his latest move, is threatening to upend the Syria project slightly, but not completely. And if you look back at John McCain, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, they helped to build the Free Syrian Army. They helped to build the Syrian opposition, to militarize them, to send them weapons and support. And right now, that job is now changed. So those soldiers have been in Turkey for a number of years, have been given safe haven in Turkey over the border. So they're now working for Turkey. So Erdogan has invaded.
He's even given a lot of them Turkish citizenship, by the way.
He has. So that's the vanguard. That's the front line of the Turkish forces. And they've been rebranded from the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, to the Syrian National Army by the, quote, interim government of the Syrian Liberation Movement based in Turkey now. So that was important that the U.S. armed them to hopefully to upend the regime or the government in Damascus. And at the same time, the U.S. was backing the Syrian Democratic Forces.
That's the Kurdish.
Kurdish-led, but not completely Kurdish, about 40% Arab militias, but led by what you would call the YPG or PKK militants. And
which both America and Turkey consider to be terrorist organizations.
Officially, yes. Officially, yes. So this is the U.S. has partnered with them. The reason they partnered with them, and this is back to the Syria project, because if you look at the oil fields, for instance, not just the Kurdish independent state, which the U.S. is constantly promising, the British and the Americans have promised the Kurdish, various Kurdish factions, whether they be Iraqi Kurdistan, which is very different than the Kurds in Syria. The Kurdish militants in Syria are definitely following Abdullah Öcalan, very much the
more leftist, red stars, red flags, and so on.
Yeah, a communitarian, libertarian, stroke Marxist, whereas the Barzani Kurdish factions or community is more tribal-based.
Tribal, conservative.
Patriarchal.
The women in the YPG, for example, play a leading role in the fighting.
Yes.
And so on. So they have a leftist profile, but they were working with the U.S. state project, Syria project, go figure. They thought that the U.S. would look after them, and they haven't. Surprise, surprise.
So who was occupying the oil fields in Syria in 2014? ISIS was. And when ISIS was eventually moved out or pushed out to the fringes of that part of Syria, then the SDF, with U.S. backing, occupied Syria's own oil fields and gas fields. So think about that. They're under sanctions, they're under embargo, plus their own energy supply is being squatted by first ISIS, then handed over to the U.S.-backed SDF. And so Syria then is being strangled economically, cannot get fuel, has to buy fuel on the black market, even from Raqqa, coming on tankers to refineries, or having to somehow get it to their ports on the Mediterranean, as we saw with the Iranians.
As we saw when the tanker was seized in Gibraltar.
So this is the plan, is to continue to strangle Syria, to create maximum economic pressure, to keep it weak for a possible another uprising in a few years.
Well, that explains why the SDF doesn't turn to Damascus and say, we are, after all, Syrians. You are our government. Please bring the actual Syrian army here and join with us in repelling this Turkish invasion. Although Erdogan says if you call it an invasion, he's going to unleash 3 million refugees on the European Union. This is kind of gangster talk, actually. If you oppose what I'm doing, I'm going to use 3 million human beings as pawns, open the gates and send them into Europe. Some ally, some NATO ally, this.
Well, now the Syrian refugee bargaining chip that Erdogan used to extort money from the European Union.
Yeah, he's already been paid for them.
quite a lot. So he's now wanting to resettle them in what's called a safe zone, which is a strip of land across the border between Syria and Turkey. But it's nothing like a safe zone. This is about changing the demographics, basically ethnic cleansing the Kurdish residents there. Forget about the militants or the SDF residents, ethnically cleansing them, moving them out, changing the demographic, which goes in line with the Erdogan's party, the AKP, are in a process of rolling back the Kemalist secular shape of the Turkish state in a kind of a Sunnification campaign, and they're wanting to extend that into northern Syria. That's going to change the demographics.
They're basically annexing the most profitable part of Syria.
They're doing so for security reasons, supposedly, to eliminate the potential Kurdish terrorist threat. But this also is not something that the U.S. is completely upset about. This is playing slightly into the role of the U.S. by militarizing the Syrian opposition, keeping it alive, creating a kind of a bulkhead across the border there, keeping Aleppo under threat. They could possibly join up, the FSA, now the Syrian National Army, with Turkish help, join up with the al-Qaeda factions in Idlib eventually, and so just keep this war going longer, keep the instability going longer, keep Damascus from reclaiming every inch of its territory, which it said it was going to do.
It's determined to do. Let's take a call from Alex in Manchester on that subject. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, George.
Welcome. Go ahead. What would you like to say?
I just wanted to point out maybe Turkey's going into Syria to fighters back from the Kurds, which have been in prison for a while.
Yeah, they already they say America said it took some of these ISIS terrorists out. Turkey says that some of them are now under its control, and the Kurds say that a significant number of them have now broken free from prison and are running wild, running free anyway.
Well, if somebody commits a crime in a country, they're usually held in prison in that country. Shouldn't they give those people back to the Syrian government to imprison them or whatever, depending on the crime they've done? So in fact, instead of the Kurds holding on to these prisoners as some sort of bargaining tools, they should give them to the Syrians to trial them.
Yeah, of course. Alex, thanks for that call. This is a point, isn't it, Patrick? They were holding on to these ISIS prisoners as a bargaining chip. Now some of those chips have broken free. Some have been sent into Iraq, reportedly, into American custody. Trump's position is he wants countries like Britain, Belgium, Holland, France, and so on to take their own nationals back, the ISIS terrorists who left our countries and went there, take them back and try them for crimes. That's a very controversial thing here because, of course, there's no death penalty here, and people who are guilty of literally sawing off the heads on camera of British journalists and NGO workers and so on, coming back here for a trial. It doesn't appeal to many people. But, you know, I take the view, this is not the view of RT, I should say, but I take the view that Erdogan and Turkey played a very significant role in the development of this ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Islamist fanatic front. So how could you trust Turkey to keep these people under lock and key? Well, they might, as Alex seemed to be inferring, actually then put them back in the field.
Well, this is what's happened with a lot of the FSA fighters. You have ISIS among those ranks. You have Al-Qaeda among those ranks. They're not clearly, they're not all political opposition or the secular opposition, this mythical moderate rebel.
I never met one yet.
They're very extremist.
Never met a moderate rebel from Syria.
And very jihadist in sort of their outlook and also in their opposition to Damascus. So the issue of this is the Kurdish have been using this as a bargaining chip to extort U.S. support. And now they're blaming it on Turkish artillery strikes, saying that, oh, we don't have the manpower to look after these prisoners. But this also plays into Washington's hands, because if ISIS is now running amok again in the region, it's only then Trump or Lindsey Graham or someone can turn to the U.S. political body and say, oh, the ISIS problem has not been resolved. We need to redeploy. And don't think that that's not a possibility. The U.S. could very much redeploy. Trump
has held pretty firm so far, but I mean, that could change, couldn't it, depending on his other problems?
They haven't actually withdrawn all of their special forces from northeastern Syria, despite the announcement. So they've still maintained a foothold there. I think if the Kurdish forces are driven south, that will play into the U.S. agenda, which is to keep the oil fields out of Syrian hands, and sort of delay this inevitable negotiation that has to happen between Kurdish forces in Damascus and Moscow. Eventually this is going to happen, hopefully, unless the U.S.'s plan is just to continue instability in that part of the region. ISIS is now appearing in places like Homs. There are militants, al-Qaeda militants in Hasaka. So to keep Syria, Russia, its allies out of that area, because a lot of people believe they could clean that area up very quickly, restore order very quickly, and Erdogan would not fire upon a Syrian Arab Army battalion or any soldiers. That's not going to happen.
He wouldn't. And in fact, he said today that he's ready to talk to President Assad, with whom he's been at war basically all these years now. Before the war, by the way, they had quite good relations. And it was Turkey's avowed foreign policy to have no quarrels with its neighbours, which became war with all its neighbours. Near war in Iraq, actual war in Syria. Let's take another call from Jared in Pennsylvania. Jared, welcome.
Hello, George, and hello, Patrick.
Welcome.
I want to talk a little bit about this Syria situation, because this is very complicated. Probably most of your callers and everybody else doesn't really know what's going on. But let me go into some detail. We defeated ISIS when, with the help of the Iraqi army, along with the Kurdish forces in both Iraq and Syria.
I think the Syrian army and the Russian army and the Iranian irregulars and Hezbollah had quite a hand in that too, you know, Jared.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I forgot those. Yes, they played the biggest part was the Syrian army in conjunction with Russia and Iran, who helped push ISIS out of Syrian-controlled territories. I was talking more about Iraq. But anyway, we defeated ISIS, but there was still ISIS that existed. There was a protectorate that Turkey had in western Syria of an occupation that the Turks had, which was called the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is just a rebranding of ISIS. And then you have al-Qaeda in Idlib running an Islamic principality almost, where they are engaging in just massive torture, killings, beheadings, and everything else. Now, with the situation with the Kurds, my position has been very clear. The U.S. should not have went over there. However, this does not necessarily mean I support Erdogan coming in and occupying Syrian territory, which is a form of imperialism on the basis of the Turks. So the Kurds, while I do support them being reintegrated into Syria, they should be granted an autonomous territory that, at least based off what I've seen, that Rojava, or whatever I believe it's called, is an autonomous republic, so to speak, within Syria, and they have not claimed that they want to split off from Damascus.
Okay, Jared, I think we've got that. Patrick, there are many problems with the rather schematic thesis of Jared. First of all, northeast Syria is not exclusively Kurdish. It's not called Rojava, and it cannot be an autonomous Kurdish area without the minorities, Arab minorities, Druze and others who are living there, having their rights protected. Before this all started, the Kurdish people had good relations with Damascus, and why won't they repair those relations? I mean, it seems like screamingly obvious to me. If the SDF now said to the government in Damascus, please send the Syrian army here and help us defend Syria against this Turkish incursion. As you said, that would solve the problem, because Erdogan isn't going to fight Syria, because if he fights Syria, he's also got to fight Russia, and he ain't going to do that. So what's stopping them from taking this step?
That step was being taken in 2013, but the emergence of ISIS taking large portion territory in northeastern Syria, that delayed or changed the whole game plan. Syria then, Damascus had pretty much pulled out completely of that area, aside from a few specks on the map. But so then the U.S. moved in to partner with the Kurds, and again...
so the Kurds trusted the U.S.?
Because they're waving that carrot of an independent state. They're giving them cash, they're giving them status, they're giving them guns, and a seat at what they believe is a higher table. And the U.S. have come in and done infrastructure projects in that part of the country and build bases and airstrips and highway resurfacing and things like that. So in their eyes, the things were improving with the help of the U.S. But this is only a short-term deal. And when you go into business with America, you got to be ready to cash your chips out before the U.S. does. And now the U.S., you can see, is temporarily cashing its chips and leaving the Kurds holding the can.
This has been happening for the best part of a century. You know, the Kurds have been put on the shelf, taken off, put back, and so on, over and over again. I've got to take a quick break. Let's resume this discussion right after this.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
You're watching the mother of all talk shows, and I'm talking with Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire about Syria, about the Kurds, about President Trump. Just finally, although we may have one more call I'd like you to hear, Patrick, the domestic backlash against Trump's decision looks, from here at least, in media terms, inside the bubble, to be very considerable. Is that playing out in Peoria? I mean, what do the voters think about Donald Trump, as it were, ending one of the interminable Middle East wars?
Well, the talking point is, if you watch CNN and you watch Fox, that Trump has betrayed this great U.S. ally by pulling out of Syria and left them basically exposed to an invading Turkish force. And this is the culmination, in my opinion, of years of propaganda, this concept of, quote, the Kurds. In America, they have no idea what the Kurds are. They don't know the difference between the YPG or the PKK or the
Barzani
and Erbil versus Manbij. They don't know the difference between that. It's just a term. Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and others will sort of seize upon that. The networks will seize upon that.
Pat Robinson was calling them Christians. when in fact they're all Sunni Muslims.
And
we're abandoning the Christians in Syria.
And they're not.
In fact, it was your U.S. allies in these jihadist fronts that were massacring the Christians with Lindsey Graham's support.
This is true. An Amnesty International report in 2015 condemned the Kurdish militants for razing villages, burning houses, kidnapping, extortion, forcing children into soldier positions, male and female. So they're not the saintly, the militants I'm talking about, the YPGs, they're not the saintly revolutionaries that they're often painted on as in the U.S. media. So the reality is something much different.
Here's Sam in New York with a point of view. Sam, go ahead.
Hey, George. Good to be back on the air with you.
Welcome.
I just want to point out that, that's the point. Correctly, he was talking about the fact that
I'm sorry, Sam. This is a bad line. We'll get you back on the line. Meanwhile, let's hear from Derek in Pennsylvania. Go ahead, Derek.
Hey, George. I'm just wondering, how couldn't the U.S. get out of this area, Syria included? Is there a multilateral approach, like going through the UK or the UN? Excuse me. Is there a way to get us out of there while still keeping the Kurds safe?
Patrick will give you his view, but here's mine. And again, it's my own personal one. The territorial integrity of Syria is an absolute totem for me and ought to be for the UN. Nobody has a right to be in Syria except if invited by the legitimate government of Syria, the recognized, sovereign, legitimate government of Syria. So the United States should never have been there and therefore cannot place conditions upon its departure. It can't say we're going to stop breaking international law, but only if this, and this happens. The last thing we need is another foreign legion or a multilateral approach, as you put it, arriving in Syria. Syria is Syria is Syria. And the only people with a legitimate reason to be there are the Syrian government's forces and its allies that the Syrian government has invited in. What's your point on that, Patrick?
You just have to go back to the Pentagon document in 2012 that America was well aware that ISIS could emerge, the Islamic State, and form an Islamic principality, but they looked at that in favorable terms, that this would be a way to break up what they thought was a Shiite crescent stretching from the Levant, from Lebanon, all the way to Iran. They also looked at a possible Kurdish state as being something that would achieve to break up that expansion of Shiism, as Washington refers to it. And this is something that Israel would naturally want to break up as well. Hence, the Israeli support of a Kurdish autonomous state. They absolutely want that. So there's that issue. And
well, Israel wants to balkanize the area into ethnic states, because that's a justification for its own ethnic state.
That's right.
And they would like to see the Middle East composed not of 23 countries, but hundreds of emirates and principalities, Druze emirates, Sunni, Shia. They'd like a jigsaw puzzle, wouldn't they?
The great Russian revolutionary and anarchist, Mikhail Bakunin, he said, "Beware of the small states." And David Hearst wrote a book with that title
Great title.
10 years
Great
ago.
title. Great writer.
So it was referring to Lebanon, but it could very easily be referring to all of these other states that we see appearing. But my last thing I'll say is, how do you solve this problem? Your caller answered. If you're really serious about defeating terrorism, then it needs to be a full unified solidarity approach. Russia, the United States, Turkey, Syria, all of their allies. If ISIS is truly the enemy of the world that needs to be snuffed out and wiped out, then those U.S. has to come together with Russia and Syria. You can't have separate agendas.
You know that Boris Johnson once wrote exactly that in a column in the Daily Telegraph? But by the time he became foreign minister and then prime minister, he'd completely forgotten he'd ever written it. Here's Sam back in New York. Sam, go ahead.
I hope the signal's a lot better now, George.
A little bit better. Go ahead.
Well, just to the point of Patrick, the point about the U.S. being aware of ISIS.
Yeah.
We have on audio John Kerry, who said we watched ISIS grow in the hopes it would weaken the Syrian government. So it wasn't like we didn't use ISIS to our own advantage because it played a role. I mean, we never learned from the 70s when we armed the Mujahideen.
Sure.
But, I mean, so just going to this point, let's rewind the clock to 2015, when Russia steps in to help the Syrian government defeat ISIS. Then the U.S. starts using the SDF, the Kurds, because well, the CIA tried to find moderate rebels, but even they were like, yeah, we're drawing a blank here, because most of them are linked with al-Qaeda groups. And you can see the map from 2015 to 2016. It was an actual race, if you started from middle Syria, going to the Iraqi side of the border, of who's going to defeat ISIS quicker and make it to the border. Now, why is that important? Is because the U.S. didn't want the Syrian government to make it to the Iraqi border, because they don't want that, as Patrick said, that quote-unquote Shiite crescent road. They wanted to block off the roads that would, from Iran, Syria, Iraq, Syria, etc. So while they were doing that on the north with the Kurds were also themselves more or less ethnically pushing out people who live there who are predominantly Arab or Druze or whatever have you.
I'm sorry to say that's true. That's what happened. Sorry to burst the bubble of all the YPG fans out there, but that's exactly what happened. They were ethnically cleansing Arabs from that area.
Correct. And then what happened, if you look at a map right now, you would see that the SDF, predominantly Kurds, they control 1/4 of Syria. They don't even make up 1/4 of the population. That's an absurd notion. And it was mainly because the U.S. was using them to, A, block a road, and B, to hold the oil and the wheat as well. There's fertile ground in Deir ez-Zor that they're holding, as leverage. Now, moving forward in 2016, Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was the force of the YPG in Afrin that was working with the Syrian government and the Russian government, and right next door was the Turkish incursion of Jarablus. Now, what happened was the Kurds, the Turks kept telling the Kurds, hey, we're going to come and take Afrin if you don't disarm. And they said repeatedly, Syrian government and Russia said, let us come in. We'll, more or less be the federal government. You could have some local autonomy. And they said, no, 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 because right over past Jarablus were where the Americans were arming the Kurds and the SDF. And they said, no, no, the Americans will come protect us. They didn't learn. Sure enough, they came in. Now, what is dangerous, and this is what Patrick pointed out, and even Robert Fisk pointed out, that these militias that Turkey puts into these areas, they're pretty much, as Robert Fisk said, ISIS who just shave their beard. They have implemented institutionalized, Sharia law. And even more terrifying is, you can see this on Turkish state media, is they teach the children in Syria, in the areas they're controlling. They don't teach them in Arabic, they teach them in Turkish, and the children are literally like, in America we say Pledge of Allegiance. They're told, oh, Erdogan, you're so great, you're so benevolent. And that's a form of Turkey wanting to just carve a large portion of Syria so they can annex it later. Now,
Sam, we're running out of time. Thanks for that erudition. I'm grateful to you for it. I'm glad we got you back. Sam's onto something, isn't he? The Turks don't plan on this being any kind of temporary, kerfuffle. They're not there to fight the YPG for 6 weeks or 10 weeks and then withdraw. They clearly plan to seize this part of Syria. They have to know that Syria cannot accept that if Syria does not accept it, Russia will not accept it. President Putin said this very day that the territorial integrity of all of Syria is the absolutely legal, legitimate demand of the Syrian government, and we are the Syrian government's allies. So Russia is clearly signaling that they won't accept this. So what are the possibilities of actual problems between the Turks, the Syrians, and the Russians on this?
Long-term, there's already going to be problems between Damascus and Turkey for many, many years to come as a result of what's unfolded and what's unfolding now. And Turkey is going so far as to transform the educational institutions in those areas.
Pledge of Allegiance.
They're running power lines into Jarabulus. Cell phone coverage is from Turkish providers. They're providing power, electricity, and so forth. And the police as well have Turkish. It's in Jarabulus with the Turkish flag with Erdogan's picture in the police station. So there's clearly they're looking at them as sort of benefactors, sponsors. Turkey is our benefactor. So it's separating these people from Damascus. And the end game is to make Syria smaller, make it weaker, compromise.
And poorer, yeah, I mean, to steal their oil.
And not only that, the biggest fear of the United States and its allies, Britain as well, would be for Syria, Damascus and Baghdad to have good relations and to jointly have management of their own shared border, because that would end any possibility. If you have the Hashid, you have the Iraqi army working with the Syrian Arab army in a joint collective security pact with Iran, with Lebanon. You see what was achieved between Lebanon and Syria. They flushed ISIS out of the Lebanese border areas by working together with Hezbollah. The West looks at that, and this is their biggest fear, that there's going to be cooperation between these states that they've worked so hard to divide.
It breaks my heart to remind you that the Ba'ath Party, which ruled in both Syria and Iraq, could have united their two countries half a century ago, but couldn't even unite their own party, never mind their two countries. Patrick Henningsen, 21st Century Wire, thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Scouser Lar says on the Twitter, I never thought I'd see the day when John McDonnell would be cozying up with Alistair Campbell, fawning over Tony Blair. The man should be ashamed of himself. He's turned into another Neil Kinnock. He's really let me down. I used to love him. Well, don't say I didn't warn you, Scouser. I hope to see you at the Leinart Hotel on Saturday. Gray Curtis says, just one more in a line of corrupt politicians. It's hard to find a truthful one. The next election will be impossible to call, but it will be very damaging. But hey, if they don't like the results, they'll just ignore it. It's a new version of democracy. And Anthony Paulson says, George Galloway said he remembered young Trotskyist Andy Marr handing out Trotskyist pamphlets to railway workers. Indeed, I do. For foreign viewers and listeners, Andrew Marr is now the ultra-establishment face of the BBC's Current Affairs. But I've been around so long, I remember him when he was a Trotskyite. I can't actually make sense of that one. So Paul Thomason says, Mr. Galloway, you seem like a communist. What do you say to an accusation of this kind? Here's what I say, Paul. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a communist. Not that it would be any of your business if I was, but I am not. I have never been, and I never will be, for lots of reasons, the most important of which is I'm a religious believer and therefore cannot be a communist. However, you, Mr. McCarthy, should keep on listening, because if you listen, you'll learn that many people who are communists are talking sense, whilst people who call themselves anti-communists are talking the opposite. So keep on listening and you will begin to understand that the world is not quite best viewed through the prism you look at things. We've got the wonderful Whitney Webb up after the break, talking about the Epstein affair, and the equally wonderful Neil Clark talking about the destruction of Yugoslavia. 2 more hours to go. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org. Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The parents of the British teenager who died in a crash involving a U.S. diplomat's wife have flown out to the United States. 19-year-old Harry Dunn was killed on his motorbike in August by a car driven by Ann Sekulas, the wife of a U.S. intelligence official. Sekulas was allegedly driving on the wrong side of the road, having just come out of an RAF base in Northamptonshire. Sekulas returned to the States shortly after the accident and has been granted diplomatic immunity, which means she cannot be prosecuted. She has apologized to the Dunn's parents, but mother Charlotte Charles replied saying sorry just doesn't cut it. They hope to meet with Sekulas and U.S. government officials. And measures to help Britain prosper after Brexit are to be set out in the Queen's speech at the opening of Parliament tomorrow. Plans to end the free movement of EU citizens into the UK and provide faster access to medicines will be unveiled. The UK and EU are still involved in talks ahead of a key summit later this week, with a Downing Street source saying they were a long way from a final deal. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson updated the cabinet on his Brexit proposal as UK and EU officials held talks on getting a deal done in time for the October 31st Brexit deadline. As the Scottish National Party conference opened in Aberdeen today, leader Nicola Sturgeon warned Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn not to bother picking up the phone to ask the SNP to put him in government unless he backs a second independence vote. The Scottish First Minister said she was in favour of removing Boris Johnson from office and holding an election, but she said her backing for a future Progressive Alliance government relied on a deal to hold a referendum. She also said she would seek UK government consent this year to hold a new independence vote. Next, Japan has deployed tens of thousands of troops and rescue workers after one of the strongest storms in years hit, killing at least 23 people. Typhoon Hagabis made landfall south of Tokyo yesterday, moving north and bringing severe flooding. 17 people are missing from the storm, a public broadcaster NHK said. In central Nagano, water surrounded Japan's famous bullet trains while helicopters plucked stranded residents from rooftops. A total of 27,000 military troops and other rescue crews have been deployed in relief operations, authorities have said. And more than 700 foreign Islamic State family members have escaped a Syrian prison camp during a Turkish offensive. As the UN said, more than 130,000 Kurds have been displaced. Kurdish sources say detainees attacked gates at the Ain Issa displacement camp as fighting raged nearby. Turkey launched an assault last week aimed at driving Kurdish-led forces from the region. The UN says 130,000 people have fled their homes, and the figure may continue to rise. Turkey also plans to resettle more than 3 million Syrian refugees currently in Turkey inside the land it captures. Separately on Sunday, U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced that the U.S. was now preparing to evacuate about 1,000 troops who remain in northern Syria. Finally, a Scottish crofter has made a 540-mile round trip to be reunited with a special pet lamb she regretted selling. Melanie McLean from the Western Isles became attached to Norman after giving him round-the-clock care in his early days. She sold him at a sale last month, but then started to regret her decision. She tracked him down to a farm in Aberdeenshire with a 700-strong flock, and within seconds of her arrival, Norman had run straight to her. She said, "I was about to shout out, but this wee lamb saw me and came running like a bullet." Well, it was Norman. Norman will now spend the rest of his days on the croft, keeping his father, the Crofts Ram, company. For Sputnik News, I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Norman the Lamb. There was a Liberal Democrat MP of some substance called Norman Lamb. I wonder if he's anything to do with that wonderful final and fancy this news item that we have just broadcast. I'm very impressed by that young woman who's reading our news. Must meet her sometime. We've got plenty of great material and great guests coming up. The great Whitney Webb, who has almost single-handedly exposed the Epstein affair, blazing a trail at least for anyone else that is following it. She's up next. And then my old friend, great journalist, broadcaster, campaigner, working-class intellectual. He will be talking about Yugoslavia. It's very, very important. And Neil Clark's witness to what happened in Yugoslavia is just like mine, as fresh now as the day that it happened. Livid, actually. It's the mother of all talk shows.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, I like to think we've played our part in casting a light on the murky world of Jeffrey Epstein and his bosom buddies, the men I'm talking about, not the hapless, poor young women, children actually, that were ensnared by him and his filthy friends, some of them in very high places indeed. There were few of his friends in a higher place than Prince Andrew, son of Her Majesty the Queen. I'm sorry to have to return to this subject. I don't want to hurt any royal feelings, but we simply cannot have unexplained and unadjudicated allegations as serious as those now facing Prince Andrew. We can't allow our state to become one in which even members of the royal family can behave as they like, beyond the law, beyond journalism, beyond proper criticism and accountability. Now, we've played our part, but the person who, in my view, has played the greatest part in exposing this foul cesspit of a life that was Jeffrey Epstein is the wonderful Whitney Webb, who is, as far as I know, on the line from Chile. If we can connect with Whitney, I'd like to talk to her now. Is that possible, Chris? Whitney?
Hello, good evening, George.
How wonderful to talk to you again. I did say that we would continue to follow this story, and you can't continue to follow it without reference to you and Mint Press, for whom you are the senior investigative journalist. So I'm grateful to you for reconnecting with us. Why don't you start by bringing us up to date on where the Epstein case now lies, or rather doesn't lie, and where Ghislaine Maxwell is.
Well, unfortunately, I can't tell you where Ghislaine Maxwell is. Some people have speculated that she is with Jean-Luc Brunel, another co-conspirator in the case, who is alleged to be in Brazil currently. as far as the FBI probe goes, the only recent news I've seen is that they are expanding their probe into Prince Andrew after it was alleged that the FBI was covering up his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. So, and they claim that they are talking to other accusers who have information about Prince Andrew's role in this affair. Of course, to date, the only accuser who was publicly accused Prince Andrew of sleeping with a minor is Virginia Roberts, but the FBI sort of hinted that there were more. And I will be having a report coming out on tomorrow, on Monday, that has a lot of, quite suggestive information from a very heavily censored news article, actually from the UK, that was published in January 2001, that strongly suggests that Prince Andrew was receiving these quote unquote massages from these underage girls a year before he even met Virginia Roberts. Because in this article, this was published in January 2001, as far as from the information we have from Virginia Roberts, she said that she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew in March 2001. So this was published 2 months prior, and it says that, citing people close to the royal family and also personal friends of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, that Prince Andrew, when he would travel with Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein after February of 2000, would bring with him his own massage table and had a young girl personally massaging him on a regular basis during this vacation. And actually, this article I've been trying to find since I started my investigation of this in around July, and I wasn't able to find it. It's been scrubbed from the internet completely, but I have a copy that I'll be including in my report that has a lot of other information beyond just that, not just on the Prince Andrew Epstein relationship, but also talks about the Bill Gates relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, that of course Bill Gates was recently, just a few days ago, saying that he had only met Epstein for the first time in 2013. I believe it was just 2 days ago, the New York Times revealed pictures of them, Epstein and Bill Gates together in 2011. But this article from 2001 says that Epstein made millions of dollars because of his business links with Bill Gates, apparently in the 1990s. So there's definitely more coming out than a lot of, Epstein's powerful friends would like.
Well, it's always the case that the cover-up is even worse than the crime. And these cover-ups are now beginning to slip, aren't they? Because if Bill Gates never met Jeffrey Epstein before 2013, how can there be pictures of him with Epstein earlier than that? And how can it have been possible for Epstein to make millions of dollars making deals with Gates without ever having met him? I suppose in the age of the internet, it is possible, but highly unlikely. Equally, I don't know if you're aware, there was ribald laughter throughout the land here in Britain when Prince Andrew sought to explain his last meeting with Jeffrey Epstein, and a picture of that had emerged. He had flown all the way to the United States to tell Mr. Epstein that their friendship was over. And there was laughter throughout the land. Indeed, even the corgis in Buckingham Palace were laughing at the implausibility of that. So all these people are trying to hide their relations with Epstein, aren't they?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And even people like Leslie Wexner, who was the closest to Epstein for decades, has done the same thing, even though he was, by all indications, one of the most involved people in this. And, a lot of people are familiar with, Ghislaine Maxwell's role, for example, but Wexner was just as key a player as she was. But he's been able to use the press in the U.S. to basically successfully distance himself from the case. And I think, as you mentioned about the cover-up often being worse than the crime, well, if you have a very compliant media, even if the cover-up is bad, they can still get away with it.
It
but
can
what
sometimes
we're seeing is
succeed, yeah. Tell us about this Wexner, Whitney, because on this side of the Atlantic, he's not a well-known figure, but he's very significant in the U.S. Tell us about him, will you?
Right. So he's a billionaire from Ohio. He's best known for his clothing company, The Limited, which now also includes Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, Abercrombie & Fitch, and several other stores that are well known in American malls, at least. But Leslie Wexner is... Right. So Leslie Wexner is the person that hired Jeffrey Epstein in 1985 as a financial advisor, eventually giving him power of attorney over his affairs. And when scrutiny of Epstein's finances began most intensely after his arrest in July, it became clear that his wealth was largely an illusion, and that his only known client of his billionaire consulting firm and hedge fund was Wexner, meaning that the vast majority of money that we know about anyway that Epstein obtained came from Leslie Wexner. Though I'll be doing another series coming up about Epstein and Wexner using real estate to launder money and other things like that. But they were involved in a lot of other shady financial activity as well. For example, it was Epstein and Wexner together who negotiated the relocation of Southern Air Transport, which is a well-known CIA front company that was involved in Iran-Contra. Smuggling drugs and Contras from Central America to the U.S. and back again. They, well after that scandal in 1995, had that airline relocate from Miami, Florida to Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner's business empire is based, to have him run cargo to have that airline run cargo for his company, The Limited. And this was so concerning to people in Ohio's government that they were afraid that Wexner and Epstein, well, they alleged actually that Wexner and Epstein were smuggling something from Hong Kong to Columbus, which was the route this airline was taking, and that they were doing that in connection with the CIA. And this is also because the other main figures that helped negotiate Southern Air Transport's relocation were major players in the Iran-Contra scandal, including Alan Fears, who was actually the CIA's, he played a major role in the CIA's part of Iran-Contra. I forget his exact position, but he was one of the people actually charged in connection with Iran-Contra and then later pardoned. So the Wexner-Epstein relationship is very suspect and hasn't gotten really any media scrutiny at all. And this is all, public record. If you go in the archives of the newspapers of Columbus, Ohio, all of this about Southern Air Transport in its CIA role too is very well documented. And you would think that this would have gotten some sort of coverage in the U.S., but it hasn't.
And is Wexner involved in politics in any way? Does he fund any political outfits, candidates, causes?
Well, for a long time, he was a major Republican donor, and he was also very involved in funding neoconservative candidates, for example. And he was also, through his Wexner Foundation, he was funding political operatives that were drafting policy papers for politicians in both the U.S. and in Israel, specifically about how to manage public perception of the Iraq war post-invasion after 2003.
What is the state of investigation on the Israel connection?
Well, so recently there was a statement made by a former operative in Israeli military intelligence that Robert Maxwell had recruited Jeffrey Epstein for Israeli military intelligence in the mid-'80s and had been approved by his higher-ups. By people high up in Israeli military intelligence. And interestingly enough, at that time, where this is alleged to have occurred, the head of Israeli military intelligence was Ehud Barak, who later became prime minister and who we know now had a very, very close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
He often stayed in Epstein's mansion in New York, didn't he?
Yes, and not only did he stay there, he also stayed in this apartment complex where Epstein is alleged to have kept underage girls, which has still not been raided and is owned by Epstein's brother, Mark Epstein, who helped Epstein run this sort of underground clandestine real estate empire that was being used for money laundering.
How extraordinary. So if Epstein himself was not a billionaire, in other words, it was all Wexner's money, what did all these top people see in Jeffrey Epstein? It has to be the sex, doesn't it?
You know, it could be a lot of different things. I personally think that Epstein was serving multiple roles for intelligence and potentially different intelligence agencies of different countries. We have the element of his sexual blackmail operation, which of course now is the best known. But I think also he was definitely laundering money on a massive scale for organized crime and also most likely intelligence. I'll be reporting on this in an upcoming series. And a lot of it had involvement with the Bronfman family as well. One of the Bronfman family trusts is is one of the entities that keeps coming up with the passing around of these properties for $0 sales and a lot of really other odd activity that was going on in the 1990s. So I think he was definitely...
Yeah, again, Whitney, forgive us on this side of the pond. Who are the Bronfman family, and
right.
what is their importance?
Well, they are, Edgar Bronfman was head of the World Jewish Congress, which is this, sort of a global lobby group that's quite well known. But he is, they're the family that are the owner of Seagram's Liquor, and they have a very long-standing ties to organized crime going back to the 1920s. And they have a very close relationship with Wexner as well. Charles Bronfman, Edgar Bronfman's brother, for example, founded the Mega Group, which is this controversial group of donors. He co-founded that with Wexner. And also Charles Bronfman was a business partner at one point of Robert Maxwell. And they, of course, the Bronfmans have a long history of funding, donating to politicians in both the U.S. and Israel, and are very involved in both countries, and are actually oligarchs, not only in North America, but also in Israel as well, owning Israel's largest supermarket chain, for example. They were recently, just until recently, the major controlling shareholder in one of Israel's largest banks. So they're another one of these solo oligarchs that span, both countries.
Yeah, I'm in no doubt that Robert Maxwell was an asset of Israeli intelligence. Indeed, I accused him of so being in Parliament shortly before he either jumped or was pushed off the back of his yacht. And that yacht was called the Lady Ghislaine. Called after his favourite daughter. Other daughters were available, but he called it after Lady Ghislaine because she was the daughter most like him. She was most like him facially, physically, but also in terms of character. And I don't know where she is, if she's in Brazil, if she's on the Copacabana, or she's in Israel. It would not surprise me at all if she was also like him in being an asset of Israeli intelligence. Does your investigation so far indicate that?
Well, I'm certainly inclined to think so, and I would say I would like to reference back to this article that my report on it will be coming out next week in relation to Prince Andrew. So long before the nature of this operation was actually known, this article talks about how Ghislaine reached out and sort of developed this relationship with Prince Andrew that people around them, people that knew Maxwell and also knew Prince Andrew, found to be manipulative, and the word premeditated frequently came up in this article in relation to this relationship, and that it was all being done for Epstein, which is what a person, one of these people close to these three people had said, that it was all being done for Epstein. We know now that, this entrapment with these underage girls, it was a way of soliciting blackmail and ultimately, power and influence over these powerful individuals. And of course, having someone, in the royal family in your pocket would be considered quite an asset by someone, conducting this type of operation.
It's all going to make a great movie or a Netflix series one day. We should write it, Whitney. Thanks very much for that update, and everyone needs to follow Mint Press News, and your work on this continues. When's your next article? Monday, did you say? Tomorrow?
Yeah, it comes out tomorrow. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we look forward to it with bated breath. I'm sure some of the powerful are doing so also. The wonderful Whitney Webb in Chile, for the mother of all talk shows. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, on this day is a feature we started a couple of weeks ago, and I found it quite useful, not least because it shows that nothing is new under the sun, that everything changes, but everything remains the same. And a thread, a chain, a river of blood connects the past to the present. And this week, my clever friends have dug out some of the salient on this day facts, and hey, it buttresses the point I've just made virtually perfectly. On this day in 1994, peace in the north of Ireland began to break out as the loyalist paramilitary groups announced a ceasefire in Belfast. It came 7 weeks after the IRA declared a similar truce. Following this, British officials met with Sinn Féin representatives for formal talks. However, the truce broke down 2 years later when the IRA bombed London's Docklands. Following another IRA truce, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in May of 1998. 2 decades earlier, on this day in 1971, the British Army began to systematically blow up minor roads between the Republic of Ireland and the North to stop gun running. Days later, locals had repaired the roads, and it was business as usual. At the peak of the Troubles, as they were called, although Ireland has always experienced, for centuries, troubles from Britain, there were almost 12,000 British soldiers in the north of Ireland, which, for foreign listeners and viewers, I remind you, is just 6 counties in dimension. In 1992, the Tory government announced that 31,000 miners' jobs would go, with the closure of 31 of the 50 remaining deep mines. At its peak in the Second World War, the mining industry employed over 1 million men in almost 1,000 pits. In 1996, in the wake of the Dunblane massacre this week, where the gunman Thomas Hamilton shot dead 16 children and a teacher, handguns were banned in the UK. Incidentally, the tennis player Andy Murray, was a pupil there that day at Dunblane Primary School and was due to go into the library where the massacre took place. And in this week, in 1968, on October 16, at the Olympic Stadium in Mexico City, black American athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos, whom I had the privilege of meeting in Bradford 8 years ago or so, each raised a black-gloved fist on the podium during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Smith had won gold in the 200 metres, Carlos the bronze, coming in third. The second-placed man, the Australian sprinter Peter Norman, wore a badge in support of the 2 men. Good for him. Peter Norman also should be remembered in that story. Now, I need some calls. Where's my numbers? I need calls. I'm not getting enough calls. The British number, 0207 798 2255. What do you think about this Kurdish question? What do you think about the Epstein affair? And what do you think about what I've had to say, and I'm going to say now, about the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, whom the Sunday Times reports today is now effectively in command of the Labour Party, having mounted a palace coup, banishing Carrie Murphy, the Chief of Staff, and now with his hands metaphorically, at least I hope metaphorically, around the throat of the Director of Communications and Strategy, Seamus Milne. According to the Sunday Times and according to my own investigations, and I have reported this to you obliquely many times, sometimes not so obliquely, John McDonnell has mounted a coup against Jeremy Corbyn, and Jeremy Corbyn is now effectively a hostage. I'd like to see him break free. I think he could break free. I hope he does break free. But who is John McDonnell? Well, I have known him for almost 40 years. When I first knew him, he was a deeply embedded Trotskyite of the organised variety. Not some fluffy ultra-left, not some Andrew Marr handing out pamphlets. Deeply embedded Trotskyite, with some very dodgy Trotskyite organisations indeed. Very extreme. If someone had told you that the former candidate for the priesthood, John McDonnell, was an IRA gun runner, you certainly wouldn't have doubted them. I'm not saying that he was, but he was extremely close to the cause of Irish republicanism, as I was myself. John McDonnell was way, 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 way to the far left of me. Somebody asked me earlier if I was a communist. I said no. Well, John McDonnell very definitely was a communist of the Trotskyite variety. And now he is giggling and laughing and grinning and fawning at the feet of Tony Blair's Goebbels. For that's what Alastair Campbell of GQ magazine is and was. Alastair Campbell lied this country into a disastrous war which cost the lives of 1 million people and counting, which spawned ISIS and Al-Qaeda, about which we talked earlier, and sent them cascading around the world. I'm actually not interested in what Alastair Campbell has to say unless he's saying it from the dock in The Hague, facing a war crimes tribunal, because that's where he deserves to be, and that's where John McDonnell in 2013 said on tape with the artist Taxi Driver he should be. He should be arrested, said John McDonnell. He should be on trial in The Hague for war crimes, said John McDonnell in 2013. But Alastair Campbell's first question to John McDonnell was, and I quote, "Is Tony Blair a war criminal?" And John McDonnell's first answer was, "No, no, no." So what happened, John? When did Tony Blair cease to be a war criminal? How can someone who invaded on a pack of lies a sovereign country, a member of the United States, killed 1 million people, spawned extremism all over the world, all on a pack of lies, how could that not be a war criminal? And the man that you were grinning at, the man that you said was forgiven and should come back, and whose expulsion from the Labour Party had been some ghastly, terrible mistake that should never have happened. What happened to you, John McDonnell? What have they offered you, John McDonnell? Or what have they got on you, John McDonnell? Did somebody have a quiet word? Show you your file? What happened to you, John McDonnell? Why have you taken hostage our friend Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, and will release him only on the terms that he breaks the Labour Party's conference decision, breaks the Labour Party's policy enunciated by the leader over and over again, that Britain needs a general election now? Why have you done this, John McDonnell? On whose behalf have you done this, John McDonnell, Ramsay MacDonnell, betrayer of everything you once stood for? It's the mother of all talk shows, all right. I'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, I hope you agree with me that Whitney Webb's riveting report on Epstein has got us anxious, hungry for more information. Dominic in Texas is on the line on that very subject. Dominic, welcome to the show. Dominic, are you there? No, we've lost Dominic. Let's instead turn to the able substitute of the wonderful Elena. Elena is now having to deal with 12 different platforms. Comments coming in. Don't forget, if you can't get through on the phone, and I know that the phones are busy, you can tweet me, you can tweet GG Moats, you can tweet at George Galloway, but you can also comment on the various platforms that the show is now playing out on. Elena has the job of having to monitor all of that. Swipe away some of the disreputable, then reply to those that she can. Elena, how's it? Is it busy?
Very busy, yeah. It's definitely giving me a lot of work to do. So this week we've got listeners from quite a few different countries.
Can you give me some? Any new ones?
Yeah, well, we've got Turkey, Denmark, Uganda, Germany, Brazil, Austria, Zambia, Sweden, US, UK.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So, it's truly global, this show, actually. It's remarkable. It's really global.
Very different corners of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And what sort of thing are they most interested in?
Well, there's quite a few comments on Epstein's case.
Well, look, see, let me hold you there on the Epstein case, because Dominic in Texas is back on the line. Dominic, what would you like to say, my friend? Yeah, go ahead, Dominic.
Oh, yes, thanks for having me.
Welcome.
I'm honored to be here. Your boldness is an inspiration down here watching you.
Thank you. I've spoken in Texas, actually, many times over the last 20 years. I love Texas. I could live in Texas, easy.
Oh, yeah, you'd be more than welcome.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead anyway. I'm not sure Donald Trump would agree.
Well, as far as the state of Texas, we're not really concerned what anyone else thinks. It's been long trying to gain its own independence and secede from the Union. Well, besides that, the Epstein topic, it was strange. The American population is not stupid. They're not as dumb as they would have us to believe. We know that he was killed.
You think he was killed?
Was murdered.
You think he was murdered?
Yeah, it was.
It was certainly a most convenient. It was certainly a most convenient demise, wasn't it? In a maximum security, 24/7 monitored, guards outside your door kind of way. As the old joke goes, the worst case of suicide I ever saw.
And not just that, but on the case, evidence and the people that have been on his property, they have photos of many people, known people, powerful people, influential people. And he was a threat to the American oligarchy, I would say, because democracy here no longer exists. It's just an idea. It's not a democracy. It's not a republic. We have a police state. It is ran by the pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, the military-industrial complex, and I can't think of it off the top. But we have an issue here, and he could have exposed that.
It's a bad line, Dominic. It's a bad line. I got your point, I think, and I'm grateful for it. Try again next week when we've got a clearer line. This Epstein case, of course, if it was not for Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, it wouldn't really have a British connection. It's mainly an American issue. But Prince Andrew is quite a British connection. And if Whitney Webb is bringing out still more material on that, that's going to run and run. So you're saying a lot of people are interested in the Epstein case?
Yeah, well, people are saying that it's unanimous that everyone's saying that everyone's involved in Epstein's case should be exposed. Someone said Whitney Webb was great, but she would now have to look over her shoulder.
Yeah, I wonder why she lives in Chile. I worry about that, to be honest, though I'm not sure where would be safer. But the work that she's doing is so important, so trailblazing. I do hope she is taking care of herself.
Ray said there is no evidence that Epstein was murdered.
No, there's no evidence that he was murdered. But it's a strangely inconvenient suicide, and one which, on the face of it, was literally impossible. I mean, prior to the event, the sheets that he supposedly strangled himself with were made of paper. On the protocol, there should have been a guard checking on him every half hour, and there should have been 2 guards watching on screen 24/7 inside his cell. None of that happened, with the most high-profile, politically sensitive inmate in the whole of the United States, and yet he manages to commit suicide. He was attacked, he said, earlier by a cellmate, and that cellmate tried to choke him. He told his lawyers that just a couple of weeks, maybe less, prior to that. So it's mighty suspicious, isn't it? I mean, I'm making a film at the moment, almost finished, called The Strange Death of David Kelly, Killing Kelly. The more you look at these kind of suicides, the less plausible they seem to be. It doesn't mean, of course, that it is impossible that the official narrative is the truth, but it makes it much less likely. Or as Mrs. May would say, highly likely to be untrue. Anyway, go on.
There's a question for you. George, can you talk about protests in Ecuador?
It's good. I was hoping someone would raise that. It's a matter of great importance, not just for the people of Ecuador, but for example, the supporters of Julian Assange around the world, because, of course, this president, Lenin Moreno, who betrayed Julian for money from the IMF, is now hoist on his own petard, because when the IMF gave him a gigantic loan, he was forced by the terms of the loan to cut back on the public subsidies, public services, healthcare, education, and so on, that the previous government, the one that had given Julian Assange the asylum in the embassy here in London, had introduced over the years. So he betrayed Julian for money, but when he got the money, the terms of the money were, you must lay waste to the quality of life of your own people, which he then proceeded to do, and his own people rose up against him. And the last time I looked, some of the army in Ecuador were joining the people against the regime. I don't know how far it's going to go. Of course, Moreno is blaming Venezuela. He's blaming his predecessor, Rafael Correa. He's blaming everyone but himself. But the protests look massive, and if the police and the army go over to the side of the people against the tyrant, then Lenin Moreno will fall. And from my point of view, personally, nothing could be a sweeter irony than that.
Well, there were quite a few comments on Syria as well. Bill said, George, I disagree with your assessment of Syria. You should apologize to Syria.
Well, why don't you call me? Who is he? What's his name?
Bill.
Bill, why don't you call us? It's 0207 798 2255. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Let's take a break.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, Neil Clark is an author, a writer, a journalist, a real man of parts, a real polymath, a working class intellectual with the same kind of political views as mine, who took the same attitude to what happened 20 years ago this week, the destruction of Yugoslavia under NATO bombardment that mercilessly killed even tea ladies in the TV station in Belgrade. I thought we should mark that 20th anniversary, and there's no one I'd have preferred to mark it with more than Neil Clark, who joins me, I hope, on the Skype now. Neil, yes. Are you there?
Hello, George. How are you?
It's hard to believe 20 years have gone by, hasn't it, since we strained every sinew to try and stop the destruction of Yugoslavia, not just because destroying Yugoslavia was a shameful thing, but because we knew that once they had the taste for regime change interventions like this, it wouldn't be the last one. Am I right?
Absolutely correct. I mean, it was in 1999, George, that the Rubicon was crossed. This was the first of the full-scale illegal neocon-induced wars that we had, and we had, of course, a whole succession of them. And it's fascinating to compare the opposition to the Yugoslav war with the opposition to the Iraq war, which, of course, comes 4 years later. Of course, there was, mass opposition to the Iraq war. A lot of the commentariat opposed it. But those of us, yourself included, who actually were out there in 1999 on the anti-war marches, were relatively isolated, because this was pitched as a good war. This was a humanitarian war, a war for human rights. And those of us who actually said, no, it isn't. This is actually an imperialistic war. This is an illegal war. The real reasons for this are certainly not humanitarian. We were quite marginalized, and we are today even. I mean, the policing that goes on this debate is far greater than even goes on the Iraq war debate. Those of us who did oppose it have been victim of some terrible smear campaigns. We're called this, that, and the other. But we were right. We were absolutely right. And you were right, George. You were one of the few parliamentarians who actually voted against the war. I think it was only about 11, wasn't it? 11.
I think 11, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely vindicated. And you know who else was right? Tony Benn. When I went on the march in London with my mother, uncle, we went up there. We were so incensed what was going on. Guess who we saw? Tony Benn was at the front of that march. And I gave him a copy of a book, his Arguments for Socialism. Remember that one? He wrote a wonderful book called Arguments for Socialism. And I said, you know where I bought this, Tony? In the bookshop in the center of Belgrade, the city that they're now bombing. And he signed the book for me. You know, Tony was there, you were there, I was there, and we were proved 100% right. Because look what happened afterwards.
And Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, and Jeremy Corbyn, yep. And people like Audrey Wise, remember her? She voted against it. Alice Mahan Marn, and so there were some very good Labour MPs who voted against it, but unfortunately,
not many.
most of them didn't.
Not many. It was the first, well, not quite the first, because Sierra Leone was Blair's first taste of blood. But
Correct.
Let me put my thesis to you, that Bill Clinton was not nearly as excited about the prospect of destroying Yugoslavia as Tony Blair was.
No.
That Tony Blair actually almost dragged Bill Clinton into what then could have been a very dangerous international collision with Russia, which had a long relationship with Yugoslavia, with Serbia in particular, and indeed, you may recall that there was almost a clash on the airport, if you remember, between Russian and Western forces, NATO forces.
Yeah.
Blair was the real driver of this.
Yeah, I mean, Harold Pinter, remember Harold Pinter said this at the time. He made a wonderful, he pleaded with the BBC to give him half an hour to make a documentary on this. And watch that documentary today, what he says about Tony Blair, absolutely vindicated. He was saying this stuff in 1999. This is a guy, he said of Blair, who glories in war, glories in this slaughter. And look what happened afterwards. Just imagine this, George. Just imagine if there were more people in 1999 who would oppose that conflict. Just imagine how much more difficult it would have been for Blair to get away with, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan, 2001, and the catastrophic illegal invasion of Iraq, which led to the deaths of 1 million people. So it was so important that we'd have stopped this process right at the very beginning. But unfortunately, the propaganda was such. The propaganda, it's interesting to talk about this. The propaganda, of course, put this narrative out that we were, you know, the Reverend Tony Blair was going to war to save these poor Kosovo Albanians from this evil genocidal dictator Milosevic. The reality is that the war had been long planned. The reality is that the West, Britain and America were hell-bent on going to war. And at the Rambouillet so-called peace conference, which preceded the war, which was actually a war conference, we've got the testimony of Lord Gilbert. Now, you probably knew Lord Gilbert, George.
I knew him well, John Gilbert, a very hawkish pro-NATO member of Parliament for many years.
And I'm going to quote him, because just in case anybody says, oh, it's all conspiracy theory stuff, this is what Lord John Gilbert actually said about Rambouillet. He said the terms that were put to Milosevic, Yugoslav leader, at Rambouillet were absolutely intolerable. How could he possibly accept them? It was quite deliberate. A secret annex was added to the Rambouillet agreement. The Yugoslavs already agreed, George, to an international force going in there to keep the peace in Kosovo. And yet a new annex was added, which basically gave NATO the right to fly all over Yugoslavia. It actually insisted on the privatization of the entire Kosovan economy. Read it; it's online. And Lord Gilbert actually admitted this a year later to the House Defence Committee, that the terms were deliberately put to provoke a war. And yet we still have this narrative that it was Milosevic who wanted the war. No, it wasn't. It was Clinton and Blair who wanted this war. Milosevic, the last thing he wanted was a war with NATO. He did everything he possibly could to avoid a war, but the Hawks were out for him, and that was it. And why was it done? Again, let's go to inside the source, so we can't be accused of peddling conspiracy theories. George Kenny, a desk officer at the US State Department for Yugoslavia, he actually said, he conceded a few years later, in post-Cold War Europe, no place remained for a large, independent-minded socialist state that resisted globalization. So there, from the horse's mouth, you have the reasons for the war from people who were actually inside on the Western side when the war began.
Now, London had, for all I know, maybe even still has, I mean, Bush House, the BBC, housed a thicket of actors whose job was to break up Yugoslavia. I mean, of all the places in the world we could have covered with our tax money, we had a Croatian service, we had a service beaming all the different constituent parts of Yugoslavia. We had decades of trying to revive, to give new life to the serpents of sectarian and nationalist hatred between the different peoples of Yugoslavia. What was it about Yugoslavia that we hated so much?
Well, as I just said from that quote, it was a large, very large state with a large military. The JNA was a very powerful military. It was a country that was not aligned. It was not a member of NATO or the EU and didn't want to become a member of NATO or the EU. It wasn't even in the IMF under Milosevic or a member of the World Bank, the EBRD, and a whole host of other pro-globalization, if you like, organizations. So it was so important following the fall of the Berlin Wall to destroy this country, absolutely important from the Western point of view, to destroy this country, which basically, particularly when we had after the breakaway republics, what was called the rump Yugoslavia, still stubbornly kept electing socialist governments, not new Labour kind of socialist governments, but socialist governments that preserved an economy, George, with 75% was in some form of social ownership. The multinationals were kept out. The giants of finance capital were kept out. And this is what really angered the Western leaders. And so they saw that the way to split up Yugoslavia was to foment nationalist tensions, historical nationalist tensions, to back separatists. And the great irony is that the one leader from the Yugoslav republics who was not a nationalist, who was pro-Yugoslavia, who actually believed in socialist Yugoslavia, who had a portrait of Tito on his desk, was Slobodan Milosevic, who had no real truck with Serb nationalists or Croatian nationalists or any other kind of nationalists. And yet he was the man who was demonized more than anybody else, not because he wanted to break up Yugoslavia, but because he wanted to keep it together. And that was his great crime.
And unlike Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell and so on, he did end up at The Hague on trial. It seems you've got to be African, or if you're white, you've got to be a socialist, a leftist, like Milosevic, to end up on trial there.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the international connections too. Milosevic was a strong supporter of the Palestinian movement. The Socialist Party of Yugoslavia had very strong links with the Pan-African movement as well, with Libya, etc. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out why it was the West wanted not just Milosevic out of power, but when there was the coup against him in 2000, there was basically the Socialist Party of him was destroyed, and then later becomes kind of New Labour, supporting privatisation, moving towards the West, etc. So it's very, very important to destroy that because, you know, let's face it, in 1995-6, socialism had basically been destroyed. Communism and socialism had been destroyed in that part of the world, but it was one place in Europe where the red flag was basically still flying, and that was in Belgrade, which is why it had to go.
And what's the story now? What are politics like in Serbia now?
They're desperate. I mean, the economic situation is desperate. There's been a tremendous, even under people live better. And so many Serbs have told me this. People live better under sanctions under Milosevic, when of course it was one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. Certainly in Europe, the most sanctioned country in Europe. People lived better then, because there was a thriving domestic industry, that there were jobs, etc., than they do now, where we've had, since 2000, we've had mass privatization, unemployment, poverty. So it really is a desperate state. And that's all over the Balkans, George. That's all over the Balkans we've had that. That working people throughout the region have been the big losers in all of this. Who benefited? Who benefits from the breakup of Yugoslavia? It's not been the ordinary man and woman in the street. They've suffered. They've lost their jobs. Their living standards are plummeted, their pensions have been cut. No, the people who have benefited have been the giants of finance capital, the Western powers, and the elites within those Western powers. It's been a disaster. The break of Yugoslavia has been an utter disaster for the peoples of the region. And I'm talking about Croats too. I'm talking about people in Bosnia. I'm talking about people throughout the region. It's been a disaster for them.
Neil Clark, thanks for joining us on this auspicious occasion of the 20th anniversary of the destruction, finally, of what was left of Yugoslavia. It breaks my heart. I think that Tito was one of the great men of the 20th century. Tito was a fighter for the Spanish Republic against fascism in Spain. In fact, a military commander in that fight against fascism in Spain. He tied down Nazi division after division after division with his leadership of the wartime partisans, the resistance to Nazi occupation of what became the modern Yugoslav state. He built something that was really something in Yugoslavia. and we played a big part in destroying it. I'll be back with the final hour of the mother of all talk shows after this.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News. This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The parents of the British teenager who died in a crash involving a U.S. diplomat's wife have flown out to the United States. 19-year-old Harry Dunn was killed on his motorbike in August by a car driven by Ann Sekulas, the wife of a U.S. intelligence official. Sekulas was allegedly driving on the wrong side of the road, having just come out of an RAF base in Northamptonshire. Sekulas returned to the States shortly after the accident and has been granted diplomatic immunity, which means she cannot be prosecuted. She has apologized to the Dunn's parents, but mother Charlotte Charles replied saying sorry just doesn't cut it. They hope to meet with Sekulas and U.S. government officials. And measures to help Britain prosper after Brexit are to be set out in the Queen's speech at the opening of Parliament tomorrow. Plans to end the free movement of EU citizens into the UK and provide faster access to medicines will be unveiled. The UK and EU are still involved in talks ahead of a key summit later this week, with a Downing Street source saying they were a long way from a final deal. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson updated the cabinet on his Brexit proposal as UK and EU officials held talks on getting a deal done in time for the October 31st Brexit deadline. As the Scottish National Party conference opened in Aberdeen today, leader Nicola Sturgeon warned Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn not to bother picking up the phone to ask the SNP to put him in government unless he backs a second independence vote. The Scottish First Minister said she was in favour of removing Boris Johnson from office and holding an election, but she said her backing for a future Progressive Alliance government relied on a deal to hold a referendum. She also said she would seek UK government consent this year to hold a new independence vote. Next, Japan has deployed tens of thousands of troops and rescue workers after one of the strongest storms in years hit, killing at least 23 people. Typhoon Hagabis made landfall south of Tokyo yesterday, moving north and bringing severe flooding. 17 people are missing from the storm, public broadcaster NHK said. In central Nagano, water surrounded Japan's famous bullet trains while helicopters plucked stranded residents from rooftops. A total of 27,000 military troops and other rescue crews have been deployed in relief operations, authorities have said. And more than 700 foreign Islamic State family members have escaped a Syrian prison camp during a Turkish offensive. As the UN said, more than 130,000 Kurds have been displaced. Kurdish sources say detainees attacked gates at the Ain Issa displacement camp as fighting raged nearby. Turkey launched an assault last week aimed at driving Kurdish-led forces from the region. The UN says 130,000 people have fled their homes, and the figure may continue to rise. Turkey also plans to resettle more than 3 million Syrian refugees currently in Turkey inside the land it captures. Separately on Sunday, U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced that the U.S. was now preparing to evacuate about 1,000 troops who remain in northern Syria. Finally, a Scottish crofter has made a 540-mile round trip to be reunited with a special pet lamb she regretted selling. Melanie McLean from the Western Isles became attached to Norman after giving him round-the-clock care in his early days. She sold him at a sale last month, but then started to regret her decision. She tracked him down to a farm in Aberdeenshire with a 700-strong flock, and within seconds of her arrival, Norman had run straight to her. She said, "I was about to shout out, but this wee lamb saw me and came running like a bullet." Well, it was Norman. Norman will now spend the rest of his days on the croft, keeping his father, the Crofts Ram, company. For Sputnik News, I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
So much material. I don't know how I'm going to get through it all. I'm joined by the cleverest man in England, Adam Garrie. Adam, welcome. Hot foot from the cinema. The popcorn still warm in the box that you didn't finish already. It's a very important film that you went to see. Important at least in that it's going to make a lot of money. A lot of money has been spent on it. We'll be talking to Adam about Joker, of course. We've been talking about jokers, clowns, lunatics, idiots, cuckoos in the nest all evening. And this is just a part of the response to it. Philza in Ireland says, "Oh my God, Bill, why on earth should George say sorry to Syria? I'm shocked, my goodness. What about the leaders who bomb and kill innocent people?" Bill still hasn't phoned up. Seems he's concluded that he isn't, after all, hard enough. N4AL says, "Talking about the popular uprising in Ecuador against the IMF-imposed measures, what do you think about the ongoing protest in Haiti, which also have economic and social background?" I'm actually not across that story. I know that there is an uprising in Haiti. I promise you I'll study it and we'll come back to it later. Paul Rain asks, how can they have a referendum before the election, as Labour's policy is to negotiate a new deal and put it to the people? And to negotiate, they need to be in power. This, Paul, is precisely the point. The formulation that John McDonnell has come up with is that I am beginning to lean towards Tom Watson's plan. Words you never thought you'd hear. Well, actually, you would have thought it if you knew as much as I do about what's going on at the top of the Labour Party. But on the face of it, did you ever imagine John McDonnell would be leaning towards Tom Watson's idea of a referendum first before a general election? Well, of course, he's not leaning towards it. He's actively facilitating it. And he's seeking to disable or remove anyone in the leader's office who stands up for the Labour Party's own policy, which, as Paul just said, is to have the election first, get Labour in, negotiate a new deal and put that to the electors. Adam, the Sunday Times today has got it right, hasn't it? There's been a coup. John McDonnell is now in charge.
Well, there's been a cuckoo, speaking of nests over which various mad birds fly over. But yeah, every time you think that Labour's policy wasn't already a jarbled mess of spider web-like entrails, it just gets more confused. And no one in a democracy can win an election on a confused policy, which I think is a good thing, because all the great truths in life are incredibly simple. I've said it before, I think it bears saying again. Whenever a politician says, well, that's complicated, it means either they're stupid, either they're about to tell the world's biggest lie, or they're going to lie because they're stupid. Either way, it doesn't really work. I mean, frankly, at this point, I think that we're either going to see a mediocre but bearable Boris deal before the 31st. And other than that, I think that those who may have gone to the bookie to say that there's going to be a possibility of a clean break, a WTO Brexit by the 31st, I think our finances might be dead in a ditch.
Dead in a ditch. Kevin Tewey says every Western country has their neoliberals. Tony Blair, the Clintons, Elizabeth Warren, Donald Trump. Donald Trump's not quite neoliberal.
He's the antithesis, I would say.
I would have said he was, yeah. I mean, I know what you mean, I think, Kevin. He's also, is obviously a thorough reactionary on many things, but I wouldn't put him in exactly that company that you've put him in.
Yes.
Shepherd Ducks says, I refuse to declare solidarity with protests organised by the CIA in Hong Kong. Business elites in Hong Kong are coordinating with US politicians to orchestrate the protests. As a matter of fact, most of the Chinese business leaders in Hong Kong are absolutely against the protests.
That's right.
Not least because they're bleeding profit and money and revenue. Isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. Protests in general and the anarchy, the riots that we've seen in Hong Kong are very bad for business. China is one of the most pro-market countries in the world. You don't need to like or dislike their internal policies because most people listening to this, like me, are not Chinese. But when it comes to a place where the ease of doing business is improving, where the internal markets are becoming ever more expansion-orientated without losing the traditional safety net that Deng Xiaoping carefully balanced starting in 1978. We see now in Hong Kong the antithesis of the gestalt, the general atmosphere in the rest of China. You see a group of anarchists, and quite stupid ones at that are laying waste to their own city. And all it's going to do is make the FDI, the foreign direct investment, that used to stop first in Hong Kong, now it's going to stop first in Shanghai and other parts of China. It's the most self-sacrificial and counterproductive act of anarchism I think I've seen in a very long time.
Well said, Adam. North Red says, how many of Alistair Campbell's children fought in Iraq, or indeed Blair's? Waking up, Britain. Stop sending your children to fight rich men's wars. Do you know that one of John McDonnell's supporters said to me yesterday, you need to get over the Iraq war? I will never get over the Iraq war. 1 million people were killed. The lives of millions of others were ruined. Our own servicemen were needlessly killed and maimed and mentally damaged by being sent into an unjust war, which was based on a pack of lies. Fanatic extremism of the Al-Qaeda, ISIS brand was sent cascading around. I will never get over that. I gave the best years of my life, and I mean that, the best years of my life. I gave much, maybe most, of my strength. I sacrificed my own political life's blood to stand against the crime, the great crime, high crime of the attack, invasion, and occupation of Iraq. I will never get over that. And the murderers and their liars who perpetrated it will never be welcome back, will never be forgiven by me and by millions of other people, not the least of them those who survived the war, the shock and awe in Iraq itself. G.J. Woods says if Boris Johnson does get a good deal with the EU, all these Labour MPs who are in the midst of this coup on Corbyn will not want to vote for it, as leaving the EU before a general election will be good for the chances of a Corbyn-led Labour winning a general election. Let's return to that point, Adam. This is a big week for Boris Johnson.
His biggest.
And his biggest, yeah. And Saturday there's a special session of Parliament. It will either consider the deal that he's done with the EU or deal with the consequences of a failure to do that deal. On balance, it's my suspicion that he will get a deal and that Parliament will back it. Is that yours?
It is mine. And what we've seen so far, there's been a lot of very fake news, to quote Donald Trump, over the last several days, because Boris Johnson and the chief negotiator from the EU, Michel Barnier, have gone into a tunnel, hopefully not for technology lessons, but going into a tunnel is Brussels speak, and my word, there's a lot of it, for we don't want to allow the leaks that we normally turn the other way as the faucet of information goes drip, drip. But the last that we heard was that Boris worked out quite an elegant solution whereby Great Britain, England, Scotland and Wales will be able to trade freely with all of the world without any strings attached from the EU after this so-called transition period, which is to last, I think, just under 2 years. Northern Ireland, though, is going to be in a slightly different category according to these proposals that Boris presented. It's not going to be in the EU customs union, but it's going to have a special reciprocal arrangement whereby goods can flow freely from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, and also goods from Great Britain, including all of the goods from the countries that Britain will want to do FTAs with, will be able to flow into Northern Ireland, which reminds me a bit of something I wrote over a year ago, saying just turn Northern Ireland into a special economic zone, turn it into a giant free port. And that's kind of sort of what Boris is going for. The problem is the EU, when they first heard of these proposals, said no, 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 no. Now, however, after Boris met with the Irish Prime Minister Varadkar and has had conversations with Tusk and with Juncker and the rest of the unpronounceables in pursuit of the unspeakables, they're going to try to hammer out something that will require some more compromises on Boris's behalf. There's been a lot of speculation as to what these will be, but it's difficult to see Boris giving much more way to the EU without risking losing both the ERG, the sort of consummate stalwart Brexiteers in his own party, and equally importantly, the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland.
Let's take a call, not least because it's from Hawaii. Albert in Hawaii. Welcome, Albert.
Hi, George. How are you?
I'm very well. Nice to hear from you again. What would you like to say?
I was curious. I understand you're doing a documentary about Dr. David Kelly?
Yes, I am. Yes, yes. The final interviews will be done this month. And hopefully the final outcome will be able to be discerned.
Mm-hmm. I've long been suspicious about his death.
Everyone is, Albert. There's no one. Absolutely no. I don't think John McDonnell asked Alistair Campbell about David Kelly, but I would have. There's no one believes, on face value at least, the official story of the British state. Not least because all the papers are locked up for 80 years, 80.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, part of the reason I wanted to ask about it is what, besides the obvious, which is I don't believe that Dr. David Kelly committed suicide. I'll just put that out there. What was intriguing about his, because he's involved with the Iraq War, and I think that's one of the reasons why he wound up how he wound up. But what I was curious about is what made you interested in Dr. David Kelly to the extent that you would do a documentary about it? I'm curious about that.
Because it's the same cast as my last film, which was called The Killings of Tony Blair. It was the same subject matter, the Iraq War, which will never leave me. Iraq is carved into my heart. It's in my life's blood. I dream about it. There was a time, Albert, if I heard the word Iraq spoken, I turned as if someone had called my name. So I'm determined to get to the bottom of all of these matters, and the David Kelly affair is out of the very same file. David Kelly was a whistleblower, we'd call him now, who had the potential to bring the Tony Blair war government down, crashing about their own ears, because he knew that the war was based on a pack of lies. And because he was who he was, a very senior, most senior weapons inspector in Iraq, and had worked for the British state with maximum security clearance in many theatres in the world in terms of arms negotiations, disarmament, and so on, that he would be believed rather more readily than Alistair Campbell. Let me take a quick break, and coming up, it's a review of The Joker.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, Graham Riley thinks I'm wrong. The Leave campaign was based on lies and mistruth, not to mention the mass of new information since 2016. Hashtag Yellowhammer. And James McHaffey says, George, you sound nuts and daft. McDonnell is a really good guy. Think things through a bit rather than trying to stuff Labour. You think that's what I'm trying to do, James? You think that? Duncan McEwen says, as George might say, if you think that Epstein committed suicide, there's a bridge that I would like to sell you. And Anna Luisa says, Prince Andrew's paedophile friend Jeffrey Epstein bragged of abusing more than 1,000 girls, some of whom were underage, trafficked into the US from Brazil, it was claimed yesterday. Tom Jarvis says, evening guys, I've heard that Jess Phillips has visited the homes of 25,000 Labour Party members this weekend and feels she has the support to become the next party leader. Does she have a chance? There's Bob Hope and there's no hope. Socialist Tipster says, I can remember the time when a young Politico called Tom Watson came to work on Brian Gould's Labour leadership campaign. I wonder whatever happened to that young fellow. Scouser Lar says, John McDonnell, the backbencher, was superb. John McDonnell, the shadow chancellor, is a different person, unfortunately. And T. Paris says, George, could you please mention the Back to 60s crowdfunder for all 1950s women so that they can appeal against the unfair decision at the High Court? And you get that at www.crowdfunder.co.uk/appeal. And Alex says, what's the difference between Saudi Arabia and ISIS? Saudi Arabia cuts more people's heads off. And Ian Puddick says, why doesn't Assad say, leave my territory, or else, with Russia as backup? So lots of issues, Adam, not that much time, because I want to hear what happened when you went to the cinema today to see Joker.
Well, it is the film that everyone's talking about. Some are already calling it the film of the decade, which is the decade is going to expire in a few months' time, I suppose might be a fair enough statement. The initial, once sort of the dust of the plot settled and the popcorn was spilled and the sun burnt my eyes exiting the cinema, the first thing I thought was that this is the most grotesquely and gratuitously violent film I've seen since A Clockwork Orange. But much as the story with A Clockwork...
Which is no longer able to be shown. The director withdrew it.
He withdrew it in Britain, yet in America it got an X rating, so it could only be shown where they showed pornography, and in Britain it was withdrawn after several horrendous criminals claimed in the dock that they were inspired by the film. I think it's available on video once again, but in cinemas it's been a black flag type of thing. Both films also share another commonality apart from their gratuitous violence, and that they're both exposés about the state of psychiatric health in the Western world, and both approached it from rather a different area of subliminal messaging. Now, A Clockwork Orange was very much of its time in the sense that it was very much pushing the line of deinstitutionalization, which I think I ought to explain a bit. In the beginning, in the latter part of the 19th century, these great large lunatic asylums were built to house those who were mentally ill, the insane. And this was, at the time, a considerable improvement over the squalor, the sort of indoor rookeries that constituted mental health facilities prior to that. Things had been slowly improving, but it was really in this late Victorian, early Edwardian period where these grand asylums were built. Now, they had an upside and a downside. They actually had several upsides and downsides. The upside was that the criminally insane, those who, by their very presence in society, would pose a threat to themselves and others, were withdrawn from society. But at the same time, it wasn't a traditional prison environment, but it was a hospital with a prison,
a lock on the door,
quite so.
Bars on the windows.
Now, within these hospitals, they weirdly got worse over time, because as the 19th century became the 20th, a lot of frankly barbaric treatments were introduced. The most famous one, which came around in the 30s, 40s, was the frontal lobe lobotomy, where a doctor would literally scramble the front of one's brain with an ice pick. So incredibly crude, incredibly fast, and it essentially had various levels of utter destruction of one's mental capacities. And even more scandalously, sometimes this procedure was given to children who were just a bit rambunctious and ill-behaved. I say, you know, a bit of a belting and a stern word, not brain damage, but that's where we were. Now, there were several important political figures, all very famous, who led to a deinstitutionalized movement which said, let's close down these giant lunatic asylums, these mental hospitals. In America, this move was led by JFK, whose sister was lobotomized, and he never forgave, nor frankly should he have forgiven, the people who did that. In Britain, it was the passion of Enoch Powell, and I would go so far to say is Enoch Powell's Water Tower speech about this very subject is his most controversial speech ever. Now, not many people would say that. The reason I say that is because using different verbiage, his views on immigration and our mainstream policy, whether they mean it or not is a different issue, but what was taboo when he said it is quite mainstream. His views on the EU, totally mainstream, and his views opposing the brutal treatment of the Mau Mau in Kenya is quite mainstream, even ironically in the Labour Party. But this idea of deinstitutionalization proved to be very controversial in both countries. Another man who might not be associated with this in people's minds is, in fact, and that's Ronald Reagan, who, when he was the governor of California, he did what Kennedy tried to do at a national level and what Powell argued for at a national level in Britain. It really happened a bit later under the Thatcher government when some of these policies were implemented. They called it care in the community in Britain. In America, they called it something similar. Now, this was the idea that because of the horrors, the genuine horrors that took place in these institutions, it was better to to create halfway houses, smaller places.
Care in the community.
Indeed. And there was some wisdom to that. The downside, though, is how it turned out. They gave lunatics, sometimes very violent ones, to themselves and others, drugs, and said, take your medication and walk down the street with everyone else. That hasn't ended up well. Since then, we've seen...
And is that what the Joker is about?
It's the subtext. In my view, it's the subtext, because the story is about a man who ostensibly went through a brain-damaging experience as a child. I won't say more because I don't want to give away the plot, but that started him on a road to experiencing worse and worse social and familial stimuli, which created a spiral of mental degeneracy. The man is a lunatic. He's not a hero. He's not even an anti-hero. He's a lunatic, which is different than being purely wicked, because one can be somewhat sane and somewhat wicked. In fact, someone can get elected to the high offices of state if one's like that. But this man was a genuine psychological basket case. And there was one part of the film which doesn't really give anything away, where his once-a-week meeting with a mental health worker was shut down because of cuts, and where the asylum where he had spent previous time and where his members of his family had spent was in quite a bad way because of malinvestment. And so I think the entire sort of moral of the story, and in spite of the grotesque violence, it has one, it's that this care in the community, this let's throw drugs at a problem and hope that it solves a problem without thinking of the human angle and the psychoanalytical angle, I think for me that was the overall moral of the story.
It's got me frightened already, and I haven't
It is frightening.
seen it. We've got another point of view, may or may not be a different point of view. Christina on Skype. I hope that Christina can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, George.
Tell me, you've seen the film. What did you think of it?
Well, everything that comes out of America right now cannot be neutral, and it's hugely political, and one cannot underestimate the power of the film industry and American mass culture in propagating ideas, whatever the genre. Many people dismiss it as simply a story based on a comic book, but I would say that first of all, I agree that it glorifies, it can be seen as a glorifying portrayal of a disturbed and hateful man, and that's why it has stirred a lot of controversy in America, as it touches upon liberal sensibilities, as Democrats want to see a stop in gun attacks. Of course, they have no problem seeing much worse violence on the international scale, but let's not then be hypocrites about being shocked about the violence portrayed in a movie. There is much worse ugliness and violence caused by imperialism in reality. But going back to the Joker, it is the story of an origin story. It's about the genesis of an anti-hero, and he's the ultimate anti-hero because he takes the face of the ultimate other. I mean, he's completely alienated, a disturbed man, as Adam said. However, in terms of instead of causing alienation and appalling feelings, the director makes the audience tend to empathize fully. The study is so close, the bodily study, and in fact the playing, the interpretation of Joaquin Phoenix, the actor who plays the Joker, is so intense, so harrowing, that as an audience you are pushed to empathize and to prove your humanity by empathize with this trauma of abuse, these beatings after beatings that transform this into a revenge of poetic justice. So in a world that lacks empathy, that lacks compassion, the audience is almost pushed to prove their humanity by empathize with this anti-hero.
And you think that's dangerous?
I think that's very dangerous. I think it can be quite reactionary in that, although it appears to be a radical solution, it provides no solutions. It's actually creating, it's parallelly the origin story of a fictional social movement that is based on this empathy. Whereas you have mass movement, you have crowds of people identifying as this traumatized other and actually wearing the mask that represent his trauma. So in a way, it's almost like an identity politics rebellion, is masses of people embodying a hurt, afflicted I under an invisible directing hand. That, of course, has an iconography that's very much current. It refers to recent protests, for example, of masked rioters that we've seen in Hong Kong. And of course, you know, we see here the function of the mask as something that is antisocial. It is not something that represents collectivity, that represents humanity, but on the contrary, it only stands for a very specific individuality. And I would say that it loses, therefore, its social subversive power and becomes nihilistic and anarchic. It's a carnival of chaos, descending into chaos, without building something positive.
A carnival of chaos. I must say, Christina and Adam, that I feel a bit like I did when I discovered that poppers were not things from children's parties, but something else entirely. The Joker is something my small children know, from the Batman, from the superhero comics and so on. They think the Joker is a kind of funny thing.
Not anymore.
Now, from listening to both of you, I'd be actually terrified that my children got to know any more about this Joker. Adam?
I certainly don't think that this is as far from a children's film as one could possibly get. I think it's a very interesting point that Christina's mentioned about empathy. I think that there's certainly an urge among some to empathize with the antagonist, who's also the protagonist in many ways, in this film. And there was certainly, the director, because of the stylistic techniques, was fishing for that. But penultimately, because the man is not only insane, but so incredibly evil, I think that the kind of empathy that one shows is an empathy towards ourselves. Where as a society have we gone wrong? It's inevitable that people with this level of mental degeneracy will be produced, but what do we do with them? And I think that, frankly, the solution that I reached is that care in the community doesn't work for a number of systematic and logistical reasons. People are being overprescribed drugs when a human touch, whether it's from a doctor, whether it's from a therapist who isn't a doctor, who have their own unique skills that sometimes are overlooked by the medical profession, they're both valid. I think that we need to go back to a more psychoanalytic approach, but at the same time we need to marry it to a more modern institutionalization that is free of the barbarity of the past, but which nevertheless is safe for the patient and safe for society.
Christina, last word to you. What's your thought on what Adam has just said and your final words?
I think it is important to see that there are real social movements out there that can be based on class analysis and solidarity, and in which movements people are not hiding their faces, they're using their faces, they're using their class identity to build solidarity and to build something positive. And this is never going to be, of course, portrayed by mainstream Hollywood movies. And if we are looking to find something dangerous for the ruling classes, that is not to be found in fictional narratives, that is to be found in theory and anti-imperialist analysis.
Well, there you go, Christina and Adam. Thanks for that review of Joker. I don't think I'll go and see it myself. It doesn't sound like my cup of tea.
I'm more of a Lawrence of Arabia man myself.
Yes, just in time, says Ask Adam, is there an election integrity movement in the UK like we have in the US? Or is your system more resistant to gerrymandering and computer vote flipping in key constituencies?
Well, there's no computer voting in the UK. It's still
Ours is very, very primitive. You put an X on a piece of paper, you fold it, and you put it in a box. That's it.
And then it turns up somewhere in southwest Athens. No, it's actually, I think the biggest problem with the electoral system in the UK is postal voting. Now, postal voting was initially something designed for the elderly and the infirm who might have a difficult time, especially during a winter election, to get to the polling place. I have zero problem with that. What I do have a problem with is people who can vote in person. They have these postal votes, and there have been so many instances of this being so horribly abused that I think that's the biggest problem. There's gerrymandering in every country in the world. Frankly, the only thing one can't really gerrymander is a referendum, and that's the thing that people are losing their heads over. Who would have thought? But you can't have any constituency, district or region-based election without a bit of gerrymandering, but I think that there's many worse examples in the UK. This fraudulent postal voting is the biggest issue.
Okay, Liam Ryan, who's a top man, says, will Trump stand by his word and fully withdraw his troops from Syria?
Well, that's the gajillion-dollar question, but I will say this. This comes down to a matter of human nature, and it comes down to this classic battle between this swampy deep state and Donald Trump. But I will say this. In the week, he gave a speech in the White House with Pence and the other goons next to him, and it was about the sorrow that he felt seeing the bodies come home from wars like Iraq. And whatever one says about Donald Trump...
It was actually a powerful little piece. I mean, I watched that. I watched what Trump said, and no other US politician would have said that.
No. I remember one of my favourite simple lines from Shakespeare when Brutus is killed, and the line is, it was a man. And I thought with Trump, this is a man. For everything he is, and he's many things, I genuinely think that when he sees those bodies come back in boxes, he thinks of his own children, because there's never been any allegations that he's been a bad father. He certainly loves his children. Some ironically say he loves them too much, nepotism and all that. But I honestly think...
A bad husband, that's for sure.
Yeah, I won't argue with that one. But I honestly think that he feels what ordinary people feel, which is that these boys coming home, they are frankly boys. When they're coming home like that, they're not fighting to save lives of the people in their country. They're fighting for a ghoulish oligarchy from the lower regions of hell. He ran on an election platform saying that in 2016. I'm glad that that version of Trump is back, and I say the impeachment has probably led him to go back to his roots. He's in campaign mode. He's in fighting mode, and that's the best possible Donald Trump there is.
Helen Lakin says, brilliant guest spot from Neil Clark. I was totally unaware of the reasoning behind and what actually happened to Yugoslavia. I shouldn't really be surprised anymore, but I'm indeed still shocked to discover more details of the dirty wars the UK has been involved in. Thanks for that, Helen. Let's take our last break as we approach the last 15 minutes or so of the show.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration...
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Breaking news from Syrian state TV. The Syrian Arab Army is moving north. The BBC say with agreement with the Kurdish formations that are fighting there. Perhaps the story that we brought you earlier this evening will now look a little more clear to you as you absorb that news. Of course, there are perils ahead. If Turkey were to clash with the Syrian Arab Army, then a full-scale war would exist between Syria and its neighbour Turkey, which is a member of NATO. That poses some intriguing possibilities, Adam. Turkey invokes its NATO clause. An attack on a member is an attack on all the members, even though Turkey is defying NATO in invading Syria in the first place. Your comments, please.
My comments are a bit counterintuitive. What you're saying could absolutely happen, but then there's an elephant in the, there's a bear in the room, and that's Russia. Now, Turkey has a great relationship with Russia, and of course, Syria, Assad's government, has a infamously great relationship with Russia. It's not in Russia's interest to see two of its allies restart a hot war just when everything was slowly grinding to some degree of normalcy. The way I foresee this happening, assuming that the Syrian Arab troops keep advancing in this direction, is that Russia will get on the phone to both the Turkish government and the Syrian government in Damascus and say, we're going to draw a line in the sand. The Turks are allowed to stay into part of Syrian territory in the borderland and set up a safe zone, much as Russia had a similar agreement with Turkey in northwestern Syria, but you can't come south of this line because that's where the Syrian forces are, and there will be many in the Pentagon who will want to get back in because of that. But I have a feeling that Trump and Russia will do the following. I think that Trump has made his decision, and so has Putin, to trade Ukraine for Syria. In other words, Moscow is going to abandon eastern Ukraine in exchange for the United States abandoning eastern Syria. Not zero sum, not all at once, but in the medium term, that's where I see this going.
Interesting. I'm not sure I agree, but the hour is late. Let's hear from Richard in Manchester. Tony Blair. Richard.
Hello, Mr. Galloway. Hello, Adam. Thanks for taking my call.
Welcome.
George, I voted for Tony Blair, and I'm seeing things over the last year or two that I just question myself as to what the heck I was doing. To be honest, Andrew Neil called him out the other day, and he was in his £5,000 suit, and he said, "You're not a Democrat, Mr. Blair." And there was a shock, horror look on his face, and he said, "Oh, I am one of the best Democrats. Don't worry about that." And then he said, yes, he did, honestly. He said, all you want to do is have another referendum on behalf of the EU and Barnier and Verhofstadt and those other unelected people. All they want is our money. All they want is our army. All they want is our tax system. They want to dictate immigration, and they want to bring us to our knees like they have done several other countries. Don't you think it's about time that the people in this country rose up and said, we've had enough of you. He's caused so much trouble in the world, and thank you very much for the education you've given me with regards to Kosovo tonight, because I've been to that country as well. And I just feel, when my dentist tells me that 16 of his family, one bomb wiped them all out after Blair started his illegitimate war, that sort of brought it all home to me, and I said, oh, enough is enough. And yet here he is, still running around, and I wonder if you could inform me, or Adam could inform me, what is he doing? Does he get money for this, for all this propaganda?
I don't think he needs. I don't think he needs any more money. He earns a lot of money, including from the Saudi royal family, in the past, from the Kuwaiti royal family, from many other places around the world. He has amassed, according to my film, The Killings of Tony Blair, a fortune in excess of £100 million. So I don't think he's directly now doing it for money. He's an actor-manager who really can't retire, can't stay away from the limelight, from the roar of the crowd, and he gets it. Our media will drop everything to come to his feet. If he announced a press conference right now, every media outlet in the country would be there, and he is given, usually scarcely challenged, opportunity to spin his deception ever more deadly. Andrew Neil is a different kettle of fish. Andrew Neil is, in my opinion, the only person on the BBC worthy of their salt. And Andrew Neil, I thought, skewered him perfectly in the interview that you were talking about. Thanks very much, Richard, for the call. Let me hear from Daniel in British Columbia, in Canada. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hey, George, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Fantastic.
A bit of an echo, so I hope you can hear me.
No, we can hear you fine.
So I just wanted to make an observation and then get your comment on it, and it's about the differences and maybe similarities between the restrictive smear campaigns by mainstream media in your country and in mine about, Jeremy Corbyn there, and, well, it's actually not my country, it's the country to the south of us, but sometimes it feels like
Freudian slip if there
it's
was
the same one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bernie Sanders here. And what I've noticed is that lately the U.S. media is being really sneaky about it. So on CNN, they'll distort the color on a picture of Bernie, making his face look red. Katie Halper has chronicled this. Or they'll, just in a New York Times article, they'll sort of sneakily quote Democratic insiders and make it sound as if a lot of Democrats have these concerns about him. Whereas in the UK, there's just outright fabrications of, smears of anti-Semitism and things like that. I wanted to know if you've noticed any differences in these smear campaigns and what it says about the media culture in each country. Well,
the media are not a profession. They're not, like doctors or chartered surveyors. The media are hired guns, and they fire in the direction of those that hired them, want them to. And they don't even have to be told. They instinctively know what way they're facing and against whom they are to be facing. And so the mass media here in Britain is owned by 5 or 6 individuals, many of them foreign, most of them dodging British taxation, who own almost all the newspaper circulation. That newspaper circulation drives the television and radio agenda. I can tell you, having worked for many years in a commercial radio station, most shows are driven by the newspapers. You literally have a pile of newspapers. And if you don't have enough people or enough sense to know what it is that you want to talk about on your radio show, you just talk about what's in the newspapers. And therefore, the entire thing is circular. So the prevailing orthodoxy, which is represented by the very narrow spectrum of newspaper ownership and opinion in Britain, so that The Guardian, for example, will consider itself, tell people it is a quote-unquote liberal paper, the Telegraph a conservative paper, but the distance between them, frankly, you couldn't slip sixpence between them. Two cheeks of the same backside. They are all in the prevailing orthodoxy, setting the limits of the prevailing orthodoxy and anathematizing anyone outside of that prevailing orthodoxy as either mad or bad. I mean, you're talking about the Joker. In the run-up to the Iraq War, Daniel, I was treated by the BBC as if I was Joker. I must be mad, I must be bad, I'm probably both, and a health warning is placed around everything that you say, even though everything that I said turned out to be true, and everything my enemies said turned out to be false, except where it was a deliberate falsehood. But that didn't stop them. As each successive war had to be trumpeted, the same process began again. Even the same journalists, the same commentators, all involved in the same propaganda exercise, and those who stood against it had to be anathematized all over again. Adam, last word to you on that.
Well, I think that it would be nice to get back to an issues-based politics, but the problem is I call Twitter a kind of lunatic asylum, but I really shouldn't. It's care in the community, and there's plenty of jokers around with very serious threats that they make on a regular basis and all. And then, of course, there's the junior jokers who just throw insults but never have the fortitude to actually phone into a radio station, their loss. I'd like to get back to an issues-based system, but there's two things that need to happen, one in the UK, one in the US. First, Brexit needs to happen in Britain, because there's no chance of business as usual or even civility as usual until it does. And in the United States, the Democrats need to develop a policy other than Donald Trump is the devil. Until they do that, it's going to not be business as usual, and we'll be living in Jokerland for a long time.
Daniel, thanks for that call. Simon is in London, probably the last call of the evening. Simon, go ahead.
Hi, George, how are you doing?
Good, nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
That's good. I'm very angry at the way people continue to back Jeremy Corbyn, despite the fact that the man is a power-hungry fool who's let the Brexiteers, the working class, and indeed the country down. He claims to be a man of the people, but he's actually only a man of the people up to a point that he gets a whiff of power and decides that he wants a piece of action. He's nothing more than a false idol and the kind that Jesus would throw out of the temple. Power corrupts, and with regards to Corbyn, you're witnessing this firsthand. I myself would never trust someone like Corbyn, who got 2 E's in his A-levels and dropped out of university. However, people still do trust him. I draw parallels between him and Michael Corleone from the Godfather novel by Mario Puzo, where at the end of the book, Michael Corleone is a completely changed and corrupt character. The fact that he's done everything possible to sabotage Brexit, which includes refusing the general election, the fact that he backed the Ben bill, the fact that he wants to let the people decide on Brexit through another referendum, even though he wants no deal off the table, which will not even be a Brexit. And as Boris said, we would weaken our negotiating position from the beginning.
Okay, Simon, I need to stop you there just because of the hour. I'm not in second place to you as a supporter of Brexit, I assure you, and as most people watching and listening already know. But you could not be more wrong about the character of Jeremy Corbyn. To compare him to a mafia leader is laughable, frankly. He's in the mess that he's in because of the lack of steel with which he has administered his leadership of the Labour Party. Frankly, if he'd thrown some, metaphorically I mean, thrown some of the villains around him to sleep with the fishes long ago, he would not be in the state that he's in. It's precisely because he is not the venal creature that you describe that he is in the situation that he's in. A political leader has to show steel, has to show resolve, has to deal robustly, toughly with those that are trying to destroy his leadership and the political line that he has led. Now, I don't have time to explain to you wholly, nor am I really free to do so. But insofar as I am free to do so, let me tell you that Jeremy Corbyn has fought a rearguard action against those in his own party, and even those, it's now clear, most closely sitting around him, for some kind of Brexit in Britain. Jeremy Corbyn has fought against those who have, from the first day and hour of the Brexit decision, sought to destroy the whole idea of us withdrawing from the EU. I think he's made many mistakes in how he has done that, but I'm in no way in any doubt that he has done his best as he saw it to honour the result of the referendum. Insofar as Labour has ended up as the anti-Brexit party, that's despite Jeremy Corbyn, not because of him. You could argue that it's because of his failures. You could say that, but his heart is good. It's true. It's pure. He's not in any sense a mafia chieftain. However, he is surrounded by all kinds of villains. Some of them even on the scale described by Adam Garrie from his trip to the movies this afternoon. Jeremy Corbyn is surrounded by members of Parliament that are dangerously psychotic. And I could name them if I had time. But you know who I'm talking about. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. Thank you, Adam, and all the rest of the people who've been guests on the show this evening. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time in the same place. Spread the word about the mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the airwaves. Look forward to seeing you next week.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.